Tonight's story begins in a distant era, one touched by courage, mystery, and the gentle rhythm of a world long gone. Before you fall asleep, if these calm historical journeys bring you a sense of peace, consider subscribing, so the next one reaches you softly, right when you need it. Asterisk, and feel free to comment on the story you'd like to explore next. I'll create more gentle tales to support your good health and peaceful sleep. The wind coming off the Atlantic had always tasted of salt and the lingering regret of the old world. For Elias Thorne, however, on this particular morning in the spring of 1849, it tasted mostly of dust and the bitter ashes of necessity. He stood on the muddy bank of the Missouri River in the bustling, chaotic transit point of Independence, Missouri. Below him, the flat-bottomed ferry coughed black smoke, waiting to haul its final loads of freight and human ambition across the divide. Elias was 19, but the 4 years he'd spent laboring in his uncle's dismal Baltimore tannery had etched lines of premature weariness around his eyes. He carried 2 things: a worn leather valise containing a meager change of clothes, a carving knife, and a tattered copy of Emerson's Self-Reliance, and the weight of his father's last, whispered instruction. Go west, Elias. Don't look back. There's no future in the past, only in the direction of the setting sun. His father, a scholarly man ruined by a series of disastrous investments and a lingering consumption, had died believing in the manifest destiny of his son, even if he couldn't achieve his own. He hadn't left Elias land or gold, or even a proper trade, only the abstract, luminous concept of the Western Star. The star was California, not the dusty, sun-scorched territory of farmers, but the land recently flooded by the discovery that had captured the entire nation's imagination. Gold. Around him, the scene was a dizzying tapestry of anticipation and chaos. Wagons, conestogas, prairie schooners, and makeshift carts were being greased and loaded. The air vibrated with the metallic clang of hammers, the panicked whinny of oxen, and a cacophony of dialects, German, Irish, Yankee, and the drawl of the deep south. Everyone was chasing the same phantom, the shimmering, impossible wealth waiting in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Elias had pooled every cent from the sale of his father's watch and his own meager savings to secure a spot with a small, hastily formed company led by a stern man named Jedediah Price. Price was a former Ohio wagon master, a veteran of several seasons on the Santa Fe Trail, who demanded absolute discipline and promised an expeditious journey for a steep fee. Elias's role was simple. He was to be a hired hand, doing whatever heavy lifting Price deemed necessary. He was the low man on the totem pole, but he was moving. He watched as Price shouted orders at a young man struggling to strap a crate of picks and shovels onto the back of a canvas-covered wagon. The young man, no older than Elias, but dressed in slightly finer, if already trail-worn tweed, was clearly out of his depth. Higher, boy, higher. If that crate swings low, you'll lose your axle on the first mile past Council Grove. You paying for this wagon, or am I? Price's voice was a gravelly roar. The young man, flushing crimson, stammered, My name is Henry, sir, and I've paid my full share, same as the others. Then work your full share, Henry. This ain't a parlor car. Price spat into the mud and turned, his eyes landing on Elias. Thorne, get that bag of flour and lash it down secure. If we lose 1 bag of flour to the Platte River, you'll be eating dirt. Elias nodded silently and moved to obey. He was an observer, preferring to keep his counsel while he assessed the company he now kept. The Price contingent consisted of 8 wagons and 14 souls, mostly men, all bound by the volatile mixture of desperation and avarice. There was Henry Beaumont, the flustered young man, clearly from a privileged East Coast family, hoping to make a fortune to impress a father or fiancé. Henry had brought too many books and not enough grit dot there were the two O'Malley brothers, hulking Irish immigrants fresh off the construction of the Erie Canal, whose loyalty seemed strictly monetary, and whose spirits were kept afloat by a flask they passed between them. And then there was Clara Jenkins. Clara was a woman of perhaps 35, traveling alone with her son, Thomas, a quiet boy of 10. Her wagon was conspicuously modest, carrying only basic provisions and a large, heavy trunk. She was a rarity, a single woman on the trail, which immediately made her the subject of speculation and thinly veiled curiosity. While the men were consumed by gold, Clara appeared to be consumed by an unyielding focus. She moved with a practical, almost military efficiency, checking her axles and harnesses, while the men argued over powder and shot. Elias found himself drawn to her quiet competence. As he secured the flour, he watched her inspect a wheel spoke, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Needs a wedge, I reckon," Elias murmured, adjusting a rope. Clara looked up, her eyes the clear, startling blue of a winter sky. She did not startle easily. "And where would a young man like yourself learn about wheel wedges?" "My father had a cart, and necessity is a good teacher," he replied simply. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "Necessity. I, the best teacher there is. Most of these men," she gestured toward the shouting groups, "don't know the difference between a fellow and a tire. They think the West will roll out a carpet for them." Elias felt a moment of connection. They only see the star, not the path to it. The star is a cold light. "Mr. Thorne, best to keep your eyes on the ground right in front of your feet," she advised, then knelt to drive a small wooden wedge into the slightly loose spoke. Using the blunt end of a small hatchet, the moment was interrupted by Jedediah Price's whistle, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the noise. "All aboard. Final checks. We move at noon, rain or shine, God willing or not. We lose daylight here, boys, and the land swallows the weak." The air of finality was palpable. This was the true departure, leaving the last vestiges of established civilization behind. Across the ferry, the road was not a road at all, but a mere suggestion, a set of twin ruts heading into the immense, daunting prairie dot. As Elias stepped onto the ferry, he looked back at Independence. He saw no tears, no waving handkerchiefs, only the impatient, hungry faces of those still waiting, those who hadn't yet scraped together the means or the courage to go. He felt a sudden, profound sense of severance. The world he had known was now behind an uncrossable river. The ferry groaned as it took the current. The crossing was short, but symbolically immense. The first few days on the trail were a brutal induction. The soft, cultivated ground of Missouri gave way to the treacherous, unforgiving prairie. Every day was a cycle of routine agony. The deafening clang of the cowbells, the constant, jolting rhythm of the wagon, the dust that coated their throats and lungs, and the maddening drone of flies. Elias quickly established himself as indispensable. Unlike Henry, who was constantly struggling with the ropes and the stubborn oxen, Elias was quiet, strong, and instinctively understood the mechanics of the trail. He worked closely with the animals, sensing their fatigue and knowing exactly when to let them rest. Jedediah Price, though sparing with praise, began to rely on him heavily. One evening, by the flickering light of the campfire near the Big Blue River, the men gathered for a ration of hardtack and beans. The conversation inevitably turned to the single, driving force of their lives, the gold. "I'll have a claim so rich. I'll pave the streets of my own town back in New York," boasted Henry Beaumont, polishing his small, silver-plated pistol. One of the O'Malley brothers, Finn, grunted. "Pave the streets? I'll buy the shipping line back to Dublin and never see another American dust cloud as long as I live. We'll be kings." The dreams were as extravagant as the reality was harsh. Elias sat apart, carving a smooth wooden handle for his worn knife. "And what about you, Thorn?" Jedediah Price asked, his voice sharp. "You've been silent as a Quaker meeting. What treasure calls you to the wilderness?" Elias looked up, a firelight catching the serious resolve in his eyes. "I am not looking for gold, sir. Not primarily." A surprised silence fell over the small circle. "What foolishness is that?" Price scoffed. "We are crossing 1,000 miles of wilderness, facing disease and savages. For what else but gold?" "I am looking for a piece of ground," Elias said, his voice steady. "A place to stand that no man can take from me. My father lost everything. He lost his home, his dignity, his name. The West promises a chance to be master of my own acres. Gold is merely the fuel to buy the first seeds." The men exchanged glances. His ambition was too practical, too grounded for their wild dreams. Only Clara Jenkins, sitting a little distance away, met his gaze. There was something in her eyes, not shared ambition, but shared understanding. The first serious trial arrived a week later in the form of a flash flood during a sudden, violent prairie thunderstorm. They had camped too close to a dry creek bed that, within minutes, transformed into a churning, muddy torrent. The camp was thrown into pandemonium. Men scrambled to pull the wagons to higher ground. The O'Malley brothers, driven by panic, tried to salvage their liquor stores first, nearly losing a team of oxen in the process. Henry Beaumont stood frozen, shouting instructions that no one could hear or follow. It was Jedediah Price and Elias who moved decisively. Price roared commands, while Elias, without hesitation, plunged into the rising water. Clara's wagon was the closest to the creek's edge. The muddy current was already licking at the canvas cover. Elias saw young Thomas Jenkins struggling to hold the reins of a spooked mule. "Cut the traces." Elias yelled over the roar of the thunder. "Get the animals free?" Clara, soaked to the bone, was already prying loose the large, heavy trunk from the back of her wagon. "Leave that." Price bellowed from the bank. "It's metal, woman. Too heavy. It stays with me." Clara cried back, her face grim. Elias sprinted to Thomas, helping the boy sever the leather traces connecting the mule to the axle. The mule, freed, bolted to safety. Then he grabbed a rope and lashed it around the heavy trunk, securing the other end to the sturdiest nearby wheel of Price's wagon. "We can't save the wagon, but we'll save the cargo." Elias shouted to Clara. The creek became a river. The water hit Clara's wagon broadside with a sickening crack, lifting it and spinning it into the current. The heavy wooden frame splintered, its provisions instantly swallowed by the swirling mud. But the trunk, held fast by Elias's rope, dragged along the bank, finally catching on a large boulder where Elias and Price hauled it to safety. The loss was significant. 2 wagons were ruined, their supplies lost. The O'Malley brothers had saved their whiskey, but little else. The group was now leaner, poorer, and chastened by the raw power of the land. The next morning, under a sky that had cleared to a brilliant, mocking blue, the moon was sullen. The men were quiet, patching canvas and rationing out the salvaged supplies. Clara approached Elias as he was sharpening his knife. Her son, Thomas, stood quietly beside her. "You saved the trunk." "Mr. Thorne," she said simply, "you seemed keen to keep it. What is in there that's worth the price of a whole wagon?" Clara hesitated, then glanced at Price and the others. She spoke in a low voice, barely audible above the constant wind. "It's not gold. It is our future. It's the tools of my trade. They weigh 100 pounds of steel and iron. They cannot be replaced out here." "Your trade?" She met his gaze steadily. "I am a master printer. I have a full set of fonts, matrices, and a small portable press disassembled in that box. I intend to print the first newspaper in the new territory. While your men are digging with their hands, I will be building the foundation of the community." Elias stared, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was an ambition as powerful and enduring as his own. She wasn't looking for instant wealth. She was looking to lay down roots. "The promise of the Western Star," Elias murmured. "It means different things to all of us." "Indeed," Clara agreed, a flicker of respect in her eyes. "And you, Mr. Thorne, you have good hands and better judgment. A man who sees the ground beneath his feet is the one who survives the stars." "Then perhaps," Elias said, standing up and looking westward past the endless sweep of the prairie grass, "we both see the foundations of the future, not just the fever of the present." The incident cemented Elias's position. Price saw his competence, and the others recognized his calm under pressure. More importantly, Elias now had an ally, a fellow pragmatist in Clara Jenkins. The journey to the Western Star, however, had only just begun. The Great Plains lay ahead, stretching toward the Rockies, a land of buffalo herds, distant peaks, and dangers far more profound than a flooded creek. They were chasing a promise, and every mile closer was a gamble against the odds. The year was 1851, while the promise of the Western Star drew the brave and the desperate westward. Back in the cities of the eastern seaboard, a different kind of ambition was being forged, one of iron. Steam and suffocating wealth-docked New York City was the crucible. Its air was not fresh with salt, but heavy with the perpetual, oily smog coughed up by thousands of factory stacks. It was a city of vertical extremes, where the magnificent granite facades of Wall Street banks cast long, contemptuous shadows over the fetid, crowded alleys of the Five Points district. This was the domain of Augustus Finch, a man who did not believe in manifest destiny or the romance of the frontier. He believed in capital Dot. Augustus was 50, immaculately dressed in black worsted wool, and possessed a severe, unsmiling face framed by iron-gray sideburns. He was the owner of the Finch Railway and Rolling Mill Company, a titan who provided the rails, the engines, and the financing that fueled the nation's westward expansion. He was building the future, one cold, measured inch of steel at a time. But he never had to breathe the dust of the trail or suffer the anxieties of the men who rode his trains. His world was the 5th floor of the Astor House, a vast office paneled in dark mahogany, where the only sound was the distant, muffled clatter of commerce and the ticking of an enormous French metal clock. The Kansas Pacific Line requires 40 miles of rail. "Mr. Finch, the timeline is aggressive, given the winter thaw," stated Mr. Alastair. Augustus's anxious young solicitor, Augustus, did not look up from the ledger he was scrutinizing. "Then tell Mr. Harkins to increase the night shifts at the Pittsburgh mill and double the speed of the Bessemer process. Time is not money, Alastair. Time is a weapon, and we must use it to crush the competition before they even clear their throats." "The workers, sir?" "The conditions are all ready." Alastair trailed off, knowing the futility of his concern. Augustus finally looked up, his eyes cold and devoid of sympathy. "The workers are paid a fair wage for an honest day's labor. If they find the conditions onerous, they may seek employment elsewhere. There are 1,000 men fresh off the boats in the harbor who will happily replace them for a penny less. That, Alastair, is the beauty of progress. It ensures a perpetual supply of necessary sacrifice." He waved his hand, dismissing the solicitor's moral qualms as irrelevant trivia. The true cost of this progress was most visible not in the balance sheets, but in the grime-caked neighborhood surrounding the Pittsburgh rolling mill, a place known locally, and with bleak irony, as Cinder Alley. Here, the sky was permanently overcast, not with clouds, but with the omnipresent fallout from the mill's furnaces. The houses were wooden shacks, cheap by jowl, their exteriors stained black by the continuous rain of soot. Water ran perpetually down the narrow, muddy street, a mixture of rain, human waste, and chemical effluent from the nearby factory's dot. It was here that Maeve O'Connell lived. Maeve was 18, but the work had stripped her of the softness of youth. Her hands were scarred by steam and acid, and her voice was perpetually hoarse from the smoky air. She was one of the invisible army of women and children who kept the mill operational, working 12-hour shifts, assembling the complex track mechanisms that would guide the trains across the continent. Her father, a proud, muscular man who had emigrated from Ireland seeking freedom, had died 6 months prior, crushed beneath a load of cooling steel. The mill had paid the family nothing, deeming it a regrettable operator error. Maeve was now the sole provider for her 2 younger siblings, Finian, 10, and little Bridget, 4. Every morning, before dawn, she would wake to the shrill, deafening blast of the mill whistle. She'd boil thin oats, dress in her stained wool skirt, and walk the quarter-mile through the sulphurous fog to the factory gate. Her job was meticulous, exhausting, and dangerous. Sitting on a hard stool in the deafening, oily din of the assembly hall, Maeve used small, heavy tongs to manipulate searing hot rivets into steel plates. The heat was unbearable, the noise a physical assault. She earned 75 cents a day. Her only respite came during the midday break, a precious 30 minutes where the workers spilled out into the small, fenced-off yard. "The heat is a punishment from God, Maeve," whispered Mrs. Petrov, a woman with a chronic cough, wiping sweat from her brow. "No, Mrs. Petrov," Maeve replied, drinking lukewarm water from a metal cup. "It is a punishment from Mr. Finch. God wouldn't be so stingy with the water." The workers talked of little else but the latest injury, a severed finger, a broken leg. The man who'd succumbed to the fever last week, and the looming fear of the speed-up. The speed-up was the management's constant demand for increased output without increasing manpower or pay. It meant moving faster, risking more, and sacrificing any semblance of safety for the sake of Mr. Finch's ambitious deadlines. That afternoon, the foreman, a hulking man named Graves, whose face was scarred by an old explosion, approached Maeve's line. "Finch needs the Kansas Pacific order out by the end of the month. You're all lagging." Graves's voice was a low growl, amplified by the metal walls. "We're increasing the belt speed by 20%, starting now. Any missed rivets come out of your wages." A collective groan rippled through the line, instantly quelled by fear. A 20% increase meant the margin for error vanished. It meant exhaustion would turn to critical failure. Maeve swallowed her rising panic. She needed those 75 cents. Finian needed new boots before winter dot. She pressed on, focusing intensely on the metallic glint of the rivets. Her hands, moving with practiced, painful speed, blurred as they worked. The steam rose off the metal, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. Up in the glass and iron splendor of the mill's administrative observation deck, elevated safely above the noise and heat, stood a visiting delegation of New York financiers. Augustus Finch was giving a tour. "Gentlemen, behold the future of America," Finch announced, gesturing grandly over the roaring, smoking floor below. "A perfect synthesis of labor and capital. They call it inhuman, but I call it efficient. We convert raw ore into pure power. We take a few hundred immigrant hands and transform them into the backbone of a continent." He paused, adjusting his silk tie. "We are currently on a speed-up to meet a vital contract. The pace is rapid, but you see the discipline. They produce 3 times what the disorganized mills of Boston can manage. That, gentlemen, is why you invest with Finch." The financiers murmured their approval, impressed by the volume of steel being produced. None of them looked closely at the strained faces or the unnatural speed of the workers' movements. They only saw the progress that justified the dividends. Down below, the inevitable happened. The noise, the speed, the fatigue, it all caught up with Mrs. Petrov. Her focus wavered for a split second. As she reached for a rivet, her tongs snagged on a rapidly moving pulley belt. The tongs were ripped from her hand and whipped upward, striking her head. She collapsed immediately onto the concrete floor, her head striking a girder with a dull, sickening thud dot. The assembly line did not stop. The other workers, including Maeve, flinched but kept working, terrified that stopping would mean dismissal, or worse, a wage deduction to pay for the disruption. They simply worked around Mrs. Petrov's still crumpled form. Graves, the foreman, ran over. He didn't check for her pulse. He didn't call for a doctor. He yelled, "Clear this mess. Her station cannot be idle. O'Connell, you move into her spot. You can handle the pressure." Maeve hesitated, her heart pounding against her ribs. Mrs. Petrov was motionless, a thin trickle of blood appearing on the concrete. The sight was a raw, shocking reminder of her own father's fate. "Sir, she needs the infirmary." Maeve cried, her voice barely a squeak against the mill's roar. Graves grabbed her arm, his grip crushing. "She needs to be out of the way. You move, or you go home permanently. Your brother needs feeding, doesn't he?" Maeve looked at Mrs. Petrov, and up at the high, secure window of the observation deck, where the faint outlines of the rich men stood, silhouetted against the dirty light. They were too far up to hear, too insulated to care. The wealth of the West was being paid for by the lives beneath the soot. With a burning rage that had nowhere to go but into her work, Maeve jerked her arm free and moved into Mrs. Petrov's vacated spot. She grabbed the heavier, more demanding tongs. The steel was hotter here, the pace faster. She had no choice. She had to survive the day for Finian and Bridget. She worked, the rhythm of the machinery becoming a relentless, agonizing drumbeat in her mind. Progress, progress, progress. That evening, Maeve walked home, the mill whistle having finally sounded the end of her 12 hours. Her body ached, her head throbbed, and her soul felt stained by the day's brutality. That Mrs. Petrov had been carried out by 2 young boys on a stretcher. No one knew where they took her. She was already forgotten. As Maeve turned the corner into Cinder Alley, she saw a small, familiar man sitting on the overturned wooden crate near her shack. Mr. Silas Finch, Augustus's younger brother. Silas was the shame of the Finch family. He was a radical, a scholar, and a poet who refused to touch the family money, instead working as a volunteer teacher for the mill workers' children. Unlike his brother, Silas looked perpetually tired, his coat dusty and thin. "Maeve," Silas said, standing up. "I waited. I heard what happened today. I brought some coal for your stove. It's cold tonight. You shouldn't be here, Mr. Silas. Your brother will hear about it." Maeve warned, exhausted. "Augustus knows I'm here. He simply doesn't care anymore. I am irrelevant. But you are not. I saw you today, Maeve. You moved into that woman's place without missing a beat." "It was not courage, Mr. Silas," she said bitterly. "It was cowardice. I was afraid to lose the 75 cents. I let a woman bleed for a day's pay." Silas gently placed the sack of coal by her door. "No, Maeve, you endured. You made the painful choice for the children. That is the true sacrifice demanded by my brother's progress. But listen to me. I have read the reports from the West. They are hiring women teachers and printers in Sacramento. They are building a society, not just a factory." He lowered his voice, conspiratorially. "I have saved a small amount. Not much, but enough for a steamship ticket to New Orleans, and then passage on the clipper ship around the Horn. You and the children can be free of this soot. Maeve, the gold rush needs people like you to civilize it. It needs teachers more than miners." Maeve looked at the smoky sky, then at the small, dark doorway to her shack, where Finian and Bridget slept. The thought of leaving this suffocating city, of breathing clean air, of an existence not dictated by the mill whistle, was an intoxicating dream. Leave Cinder Alley? She whispered, the hope a fragile, almost painful thing. Mr. Silas, the ticket money is a king's ransom. It is a ticket to a new kind of struggle, Silas corrected her, pulling a thick envelope from his inner coat pocket. But at least it will be a struggle for your own future, not for the profit of my brother's mill. Take it, use it, escape the soot. Maeve stared at the envelope. It was a lifeline thrown from the highest tower of the city's corrupt structure, a silent act of rebellion from one man who could no longer tolerate the price of his family's wealth. She took the envelope, the paper feeling cool and crisp against her burned hand. Her eyes, filled with a sudden fierce resolve, were fixed on the invisible horizon. I will take the children, she said, her voice steady now. And I will not forget this place. I will tell them what progress costs. Go, Maeve, Silas urged. Go to the Western Star, and may you find a sun that shines only for you. Maeve slipped the envelope into her pocket, the heat of the secret promise burning through the rough fabric. The mill whistle blew a final, mournful, distant blast, reminder of the dark, powerful force she was finally leaving behind. The next morning, she would not be walking toward the soot. She would be walking toward the harbor, toward the long, dangerous journey to the sun. The high plains of Kansas Territory in the summer of 1852 were a symphony of monotony, broken only by the brutal, discordant percussion of labor. The sun beat down with relentless intensity, baking the clay soil until it cracked like old porcelain. The price contingent, now far beyond the familiar rivers of Missouri, were grinding through the hardest section of the trail, the seemingly endless miles before the Platte River. Elias Thorne was no longer the quiet hired hand. He was the vital force of the reduced company. After the flash flood, the weaker members had fallen away, selling their remaining supplies or turning back. Elias's judgment especially, regarding the rationing of water and the maintenance of the overworked oxen, had proved superior. To the perpetually exasperated Jedediah Price, the constant tension between them had reached a breaking point. Price was a man who measured worth in immediate, tangible currency, whereas Elias measured it in survival. We're 2 days short on the flour, Thorne. You've been too generous with the rations. Price barked one sweltering afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow with a forearm grimed with trail dust. The animals need the strength. Sir? Elias countered calmly, checking the hobbles on a particularly tired ox. If they fall, we lose the wagons, not just the flour. Starve the ox today, and we starve ourselves permanently. Don't lecture me on survival, boy. I was driving this trail when you were in swaddling clothes. Price snarled, his eyes narrowed with fury and exhaustion. I hold the contract, and I decide the cost. And you, Thorne, owe me a hefty sum for passage in rations that's already been stretched thin. The financial reality hung over the camp like the summer heat. Elias had paid for his initial passage, but the loss of supplies in the flood and the extended journey meant he was now working for his daily bread, and then some. My labor is fair payment, sir, Elias insisted. I have saved more of your assets than any 2 men combined since independence. Your labor is the minimum price. The debt is measured in steel, Thorne. The steel that holds my axles together. The steel in the shovels we need to dig through this infernal sand. The very steel that was supposed to be financing this expedition. Don't you forget where your daily bread comes from. Price's reference to steel was a constant reminder of the unseen forces funding their perilous journey. The Price contingent wasn't just a group of prospectors. It was partially a financial venture, underwritten by a silent investor back east. Price had been vague, mentioning only a New York syndicate interested in high-risk Western ventures. Elias knew the truth was likely far less glamorous. They were mortgaging their lives for a promise. The debt was real, and Price was its unforgiving collector. Meanwhile, far to the south, on the deck of a clipper ship battling the treacherous currents off the coast of Patagonia, Maeve O'Connell, along with Finian and Bridget, faced a debt of a different kind. The price of freedom that the journey around Cape Horn was proving to be a sustained nightmare. The wind shrieked through the rigging. The ship groaned and rolled violently, and the cramped, airless conditions in the steerage deck bred sickness and despair. Maeve had used Silas Finch's money meticulously. She had secured passage to San Francisco via the dangerous, long route, believing it safer and less exploitative than the disease-ridden crossing of the Panama Isthmus. But the sheer duration of the voyage, 4 months already, with weeks still to go, was exhausting their meager reserves. The portable printing press, her heavy iron trunk, was lashed securely beneath her narrow berth. It was the only piece of the East she had carried with her that still held value and hope. One cold, wet evening, as the ship rode a massive wave, she found herself confronted by the ship's first mate, a brutish man named Jensen, who oversaw the steerage passengers. "That trunk of yours." "O'Connell," Jensen slurred, swaying with the movement of the ship. "The captain says it's too much dead weight, taking up space others could pay for." Maeve clutched Finian's hand tighter. "It is paid for, sir. It is my only possession." The fare covered the person. "Not a ton of metal," Jensen sneered, his eyes flicking to the large, heavy box. "Looks like something valuable. Looks like it's worth more than your remaining passage money, which, I might add, is running thin. The cost of unexpected delays, additional food rations for the children, and a minor bribe to the ship's cook had nearly depleted Maeve's funds. She was now truly vulnerable. "What is your price, then, Mr. Jensen?" she asked, her voice low and steady, despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "I can take that trunk, sell it for scrap in Valparaiso, and forgive your outstanding debt." It's a fair exchange. It was the very debt of steel that had chased her from Pittsburgh. Her tools, the tangible promise of her future, were about to be confiscated to pay the price of her escape from Augustus Finch's world. "No," Maeve said fiercely. "I will not part with it. I will work for the passage. I will swab the decks, cook for the crew, anything." Jensen laughed, a rough, ugly sound. "A woman on deck? Unseemly. But I do need a better steward for the captain's cabin. You know how to clean, O'Connell, and you know how to be discreet. That is your debt." Maeve's gaze hardened. She understood the implicit threat. This was the final, humiliating price of her freedom, the stripping of her dignity by men who saw her as nothing more than an expendable commodity, much like the men in her father's mill. "I will clean," Maeve stated, pulling her children close. "I will work the debt. But that trunk, my tools, remain untouched. Is that understood, Mr. Jensen?" Jensen leered, then finally nodded, seeing the determination in her eyes. "Understood. The debt is measured in service, then, starting tomorrow." Maeve had escaped the soot of the mill only to find the grime of servitude. But she had kept the steel the future safe. Months later, in the late autumn of 1852, Elias Thorne finally reached the end of the wagon trail, standing in the bustling temporary city of Sacramento, California. The Price contingent had scattered like dry leaves in a high wind. Price himself, driven by greed, had abandoned the wagons in the foothills to rush to the claims, taking the best of the remaining supplies and leaving the remaining men with only the promise of a future reckoning. Elias had saved Clara Jenkins and her son. They arrived with one ox, one damaged wagon, and the heavy printer's trunk, which Elias had helped pull for the final 50 miles. Sacramento was a chaotic sprawl of canvas tents, hastily erected wooden shacks and mud-choked streets. It was a place where fortunes were made and lost between sunrise and sunset. Elias and Aias, Clara set up their base in a small tent near the riverbank, while Clara immediately began securing lumber to build her printing office. Elias took the salvage tools and began working as a carpenter, a trade he had learned in his youth. He wasn't mining gold. He was building the infrastructure for those who did. One afternoon, while Elias was hammering the frame for a small boarding house, a sleek, expensive carriage, a rarity in this rough town, pulled up to the adjacent, newly finished land survey office. Out stepped Jedediah Price, but he was transformed. He wore a fine new broadcloth coat, polished boots, and a gold watch chain stretched across his vest. He looked prosperous, clean, and utterly ruthless. "Thorne," Price called out, a triumphant smirk on his face. "I wondered when you'd show your dusty face." "You left us to die, Price," Elias stated flatly, his hand tightening around the hammer handle. "I separated the wheat from the chaff, boy. You survived, didn't you? That's all that matters. And now, the true debt must be paid." Price gestured to a large, imposing shack currently being erected on a lot across the street. "See that building? That's the new Wells Fargo office. I secured the contract to build it. But more importantly, I finally met the man who financed our entire fool's journey." A second man stepped out of the carriage. He was immaculate, severe, and instantly recognizable from the descriptions in Silas Finch's old newspaper articles. It was Augustus Finch, the industrial magnate, the owner of the Pittsburgh mill, the man who measured all human value in profit. He had arrived in California to consolidate his investments. "Mr. Price informs me that you, Mr. Thorne, were instrumental in saving the remaining assets of the expedition," Finch stated, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I saved myself, and a few others, sir." "Your assets were left to rot by your own man," Elias retorted, not lowering his gaze. Finch ignored the defiance. "Irrelevant. The loss of equipment due to the flood, plus the wages you consumed for the extended journey, has left you with a quantifiable debt to the syndicate, Mr. Thorne. A debt that, according to the contract Price held, now sits with me." Finch produced a rolled-up document tied with red ribbon. $287. "It is a debt measured in the steel we lost. You will work for me until this amount is paid, or you will find yourself in violation of a legal binding agreement signed back in Missouri." The reality hit Elias with the force of a blow. His freedom, his land, his future, it was all now held hostage by the same capitalistic force that drove the entire country. The very steel Price had talked about was the chain binding him to the east. "You came thousands of miles to enforce a debt?" Elias asked in disbelief. "I came thousands of miles to build an empire, Mr. Thorne," Finch corrected him smoothly. "And every piece of labor is accounted for. Price told me you are an exceptional carpenter and manager. You will oversee the construction of my new rail yard supply depots. It is demanding work, but it pays your debt. Refuse, and the law will seize everything you own, including that shabby tent." Elias had chased the Western Star for freedom, only to be caught by the same mechanism of industrial debt that plagued the whole nation. That evening, Elias sat with Clara, sharing a meager supper. He told her about Finch and the debt. "He is the same kind of man who owned my father, Elias," Clara said quietly. "A man who turns human effort into cold numbers. The progress he represents is built on us. I have no choice but to work the debt," Elias admitted, running a frustrated hand through his hair. "He owns my time, and therefore my freedom. He owns your time, perhaps, but he does not own your influence," Clara corrected him, her blue eyes sharp with resolve. She tapped her heavy, protective trunk. "Tomorrow, I start building my press. I will print the Sacramento Chronicle. And who do you think will be the first man to come to me, looking to advertise his new rail yard and his need for labor? Elias understood. Augustus Finch would need the power of the press to solidify his empire in the West. You will be in his office, Elias. You will know his schedule, his secrets, and his weaknesses, Clara continued. He thinks the cost is paid in steel, but we will pay him back in information. We will use his own ambition, the power of his money, to find a way to undermine him. You work his debt, and I will print his secrets. We will take our freedom back, not through gold, but through leverage. Elias looked at the vast, chaotic town, and then at the sturdy, heavy trunk that held Clara's entire future. The promise of the Western Star was not a clean, easy fortune. It was a brutal struggle for autonomy against the overwhelming power of capital. A debt measured in steel, Elias murmured, a slow, determined grin spreading across his face. Then we will ensure the cost of collection is ruinous. He picked up his hammer, no longer seeing it as a tool of servitude, but as a weapon in the coming war against the East. Sacramento, in the early spring of 1853, was less a town and more a restless, overheated laboratory for American ambition. The easy gold had long been claimed. Now, the real struggle was for control of the river, control of the land titles, and most importantly, control of the information that moved faster than the clipper ships or the fastest stagecoach. Elias Thorne, bound by his debt to Augustus Finch, found himself an unwilling agent in the heart of the enemy's camp. His primary task was managing the construction of Finch's Rail Yard Supply Depot A, sprawling complex of warehouses designed not just to store materials, but to monopolize the distribution of goods arriving from San Francisco. Elias played the role of the diligent, indebted foreman perfectly. He worked long days, earned Finch's grudging respect through his efficiency, and kept his eyes and ears open. The depot was more than a construction site. It was a hive of transactions, where Finch's men, led by the newly appointed regional director, Jedediah Price, negotiated contracts for every shovel, barrel of nails, and length of rope in the territory. Remember, Thorne, Price gloated one afternoon, reviewing ledgers in his makeshift office shack. The true gold is not in the ground, but in the choke points. Finch controls the steel coming into California. He controls the credit. The miners can dig all they want, but if they can't buy a new pickaxe from us, their dreams turn to dust. Elias nodded, feigning attention as he mentally cataloged Price's movements. Price spent his nights gambling at the Delta Saloon and his mornings nursing whiskey. But his records were meticulously kept on paper, in a steel safe bolted to the shack's floor. Elias's real work began after sunset. Clara Jenkins's printing office. The Sacramento Chronicle was a small, two-room wooden structure located near the main thoroughfare. It smelled powerfully of lamp oil, ink, and the metallic tang of her beloved type press. It was a refuge of intellect and resolve in the crude, chaotic town. Her first editions, printed with meticulous care on the small, hand-operated press she had saved from the sea, were a hit. While other papers focused on sensationalist gold stories and lurid crimes, the Chronicle focused on local politics, land deeds, and crucially, the increasing power of the Eastern syndicates. Every night, Elias slipped into the Chronicle office. He wasn't bringing dynamite or forged deeds. He was bringing gossip, numbers, and facts. Finch is cutting his shipping costs by 40%, Elias whispered one night, the low light of the lamp catching the tired lines on his face. He spread a rough sketch of the depot's layout on Clara's desk. He's using his own clipper ships, Augustus's Pride and the Iron Will. They are docking directly at the newly dredged northern wharf. Clara listened, her eyes fixed on the map. The northern wharf isn't public, Elias. The city council voted against that proposal 3 months ago. That land belongs to the people. Price paid the council to keep the vote a secret until the dock was complete, Elias confirmed. They've been working under the cover of the dredging permits. By the time the next council meeting is held, the dock will be operational. Finch will have a monopoly on deep water freight. A monopoly on progress, Clara muttered, her fingers flying across the type tray, selecting the heavy, reverse-cut steel letters. We need documentation. Gossip won't run on the front page. The paperwork is in the safe, Elias said, pointing to the sketch of Price's office. Bills of lading, permits, and most damningly, the itemized expenses for the council members, the consulting fees that are truly bribes. We need to expose the true cost of the steel they're shipping in, Clara stated, her voice hardening. It's not just the price of the metal. It's the cost of the democracy they're buying. The debt Elias owed in steel was being repaid in information. The conflict was not just between Elias and Finch. It was a rising tide of unrest throughout Sacramento. The miners who worked the riverbeds and foothills felt the squeeze of the eastern syndicates. They were forced to buy supplies at exorbitant prices and were increasingly displaced by large hydraulic mining operations backed by Finch's capital. One afternoon, a delegation of angry, dust-caked miners marched down the main street. They were led by a towering man with a fiery beard, Silas Boulder McCann, a veteran miner who had lost his claim to a rigged land survey. They marched straight toward the new rail depot. Elias, overseeing the laying of the massive wooden foundation, watched the storm approach. He knew their anger was justified, but a confrontation here would ruin his cover and likely lead to bloodshed. Price emerged from his shack, pistol belt slung low, flanked by 2 armed guards. What is the meaning of this intrusion? Price yelled, trying to project authority. We've come for the ledger, Price. McCann bellowed, his voice raw with fury. We know Finch's agents are fixing the assay prices and buying up claims with fraudulent deeds. We demand to see the contracts he signed with the Territorial Land Office. Get off this private property, Price threatened, drawing his pistol. The miners surged forward. Elias stepped quickly toward Price. Sir, fire that, and you'll have a riot. You'll lose the entire depot. Let me handle this. Price hesitated, seeing the sheer number of enraged men. He lowered his gun slightly. Handle it, Thorne. If one crate is damaged, your debt doubles. Elias faced the miners. His clothes were dusty, his hands calloused. He looked like one of them, not Finch's manager. I know what you feel, Elias said, his voice carrying surprising resonance. But this isn't the place to find justice. This is just a warehouse. The contracts are in the land office downtown or sealed in San Francisco. Finch isn't here. You work for him, McCann accused, pointing a calloused finger at Elias. You're his dog. I am a man working a debt, Elias replied honestly. And I know where the fire is. Finch is paying men to rewrite the land maps, to claim the hydraulic rights on the American River. That is where the power struggle is. This depot is a distraction. Go to the courthouse. Demand to see the public records for the hydraulic permits. Hit the paper, not the wood. Elias had subtly redirected their anger, giving them a legal, non-violent target, and bought himself the night he desperately needed. The miners, seeing the logic in his words and recognizing the shared hardship in his face, slowly turned and marched toward the courthouse. That night, the silence in Price's office was absolute. The city was preoccupied with the miners' protest, and the guards were lax. Elias, using a small, well-honed lockpick he'd carried since Baltimore, knelt by the steel safe. The safe was a massive, clunky affair, more reliant on brute weight than complex mechanism. But the tumblers were old and stiff. He worked in the dark, the only light filtering faintly from a half-moon. He moved with the focused concentration of a man balancing on a razor's edge. After 40 minutes of agonizingly slow, metallic clicks, he felt the final tumbler slide home. The steel door gave way with a heavy thud dot inside, among bottles of cheap whiskey and small pouches of raw gold were the ledgers. Elias flipped through them quickly, his lamp casting just enough light to read the tight, meticulous script. He found it, the detailed expense log for the Northern Wharf project. Entry after entry listed large sums dispersed to municipal consulting, and 3 specific councilmen, all signed by Jedediah Price. The document was a smoking gun, revealing the municipal bribery that had secured Finch's monopoly. He also found a confidential letter from Augustus Finch, outlining a plan to use the new rail line to smuggle opium from the Pacific ports into the interior, a far more lucrative and sinister operation than mining supplies. Elias swiftly copied the most damning pages onto thin paper, tucking the copies securely into the lining of his boot. He meticulously replaced the ledgers, ensuring the safe door sealed perfectly. He had gathered the storm's lightning. Now, Clara would provide the thunder. Elias delivered the documents to Clara, who, upon reading them, looked up with an expression of grim satisfaction. Opium smuggling, land fraud, council bribery. This isn't just about money, Elias. This is an attack on the integrity of the entire territory, Clara declared, already calculating the column inches needed. Finch is building an empire based on debt, corruption, and vice, Elias confirmed. But Price is the weak link. If we break him, Finch is exposed. Clara worked through the night, her press hissing and clanking, transforming the raw information into sharp, irrefutable headlines. The story was not just a news item. It was a political manifesto disguised as a newspaper. She titled the lead story, "The Price of Progress: How Finch's Steel Buys Our City Council." The next morning, the Sacramento Chronicle hit the streets like a small cannonade. The effect was immediate and seismic. Miners, already agitated by McCann's protest, bought every copy instantly. Merchants, furious over Finch's freight monopoly, spread the news like wildfire. The councilmen named in the paper retreated in two, hiding, their political careers instantly incinerated by the heat of public outrage. Jedediah Price, sleeping off his latest binge in his shack, was completely oblivious until a furious, red-faced messenger from Finch's San Francisco office burst in, waving the damning front page. "Look at this, Price. You fool. You let the papers get a hold of the ledger. Finch is demanding you shut down this rag and contain the damage immediately." The messenger shrieked. Price, white with panic, immediately went to check his safe. It was locked. He checked the tumblers. They were set. It must be a lie. He opened it, checking the ledger. Everything appeared to be in place. Then, he looked closer at the final entry. A faint smudge of boot dust was visible on the corner of the paper. He realized with horrifying clarity that the safe had been opened, copied, and resealed. He had been exposed. Price knew exactly who was responsible. Elias Thorne, the quiet, observant foreman whom he had tried to crush with a debt measured in steel dot at the rail depot. Elias stood by the perimeter, waiting. He saw Price's carriage careen past, heading toward the Chronicle office, the center of the explosion. Elias knew the storm was no longer gathering. It had broken. Price, desperate and cornered, would not go to the law. He would go for the source. Elias ran toward Clara's office, covering the distance in a frantic, ground-eating sprint dot. He arrived just as Price burst through the Chronicle's flimsy wooden door, pistol drawn. "The press. Destroy it," Price shrieked, aiming his gun not at Clara, but at the heavy iron machine. The true source of his downfall. Clara stood defiant behind her composing desk. "You can break the press, Price, but you cannot unprint the truth." Price fired a shot into the ceiling, the deafening blast echoing through the small office. He rushed toward the press, intent on shattering the complex. Crucial mechanism. Elias hurled himself through the doorway, tackling Price hard. The two men crashed to the floor, rolling among the scattered typeset. The pistol skittered across the floor. Elias, driven by the months of subjugation and the burning injustice of Finch's operation, fought with a fury Price had never anticipated. Price was larger, but Elias was fueled by righteous vengeance and a promise to a dead father. He managed to pin Price, his hands locking around the foreman's throat. "You left us to die." Elias gasped, struggling for air. "You sold this town for steel. Finch ... will ... own you." Price choked out, his face turning purple. Clara, ignoring the struggle, calmly retrieved the pistol. She pointed it not at the men, but at the ceiling. Bang. She fired a second shot. The unmistakable sound of a gunshot in the morning air would draw the whole town. A moment later, they heard the shouts of men running down the street. The miners, alerted by the initial gunshot and already agitated by the morning's paper, were heading toward the disturbance. Price saw the realization in Elias's eyes and the coming fury in the street. He finally saw the game was over. "Get out," Elias commanded, releasing his grip. "Go to Finch. Tell him the debt is paid." Price scrambled backward, grabbing his hat but leaving his pistol. He burst out the back door, just as Silas McCann and the miners arrived at the front. McCann, seeing the shot-up ceiling and the defiant figure of Clara Jenkins, looked at Elias and simply nodded. He understood that Elias had finally chosen his side. The storm had broken over Price and Finch, not over the people of Sacramento. Elias's debt of steel was now a weapon for freedom. The true struggle for California was just beginning. The morning after the Sacramento Chronicle published the headline, "The Price of Progress." Liberty Street was no longer just a thoroughfare. It was the epicenter of a territorial revolution. The raw fury that had been building in the camps and on the docks finally found its voice. Miners, small merchants, and farmers, all victims of Augustus Finch's predatory pricing and land grabs, flooded the street. Using the Chronicle's office as their rallying point. Clara Jenkins, armed with nothing but the truth and a growing stack of empty type trays, stood on a sturdy wooden crate outside her office, addressing the crowd. The noise was immense, a roar of anger, frustration, and newly awakened hope. "Mr. Finch believes his wealth shields him," Clara shouted, her voice hoarse but ringing with conviction. "He believes he can buy your counsel, buy your claims, and buy your silence. But the truth is not for sale. The power of his steel ends where your courage begins." Elias Thorne stood beside her, a visible symbol of defiance. He was the man who had worked beneath the steel, the foreman who had defected from the enemy camp. He had forfeited his debt, and by extension, his entire immediate future. He was legally a wanted man, but in the eyes of the crowd, he was a hero. "Finch controls the supply lines," Elias yelled, pointing west toward the river, where the Augustus's Pride clipper ship was rumored to be docking with a new shipment of rails and supplies. "If we allow him to land that cargo, he will choke this town until we can't breathe. He must not be allowed to take root here." The crowd erupted in cheers and cries of agreement. The immediate choice was clear: liberty, or the continued rule of Finch's progress. The reaction from the other side of the crossroads was swift and merciless. Augustus Finch, having ridden the stagecoach from San Francisco in a state of icy, controlled fury, established a temporary command post in the lavishly furnished office of the corrupt land surveyor. He didn't rant. He simply calculated the damage. Jedediah Price is a fool, an easily panicked liability, Finch told his new stone-faced security chief, a former Pinkerton agent named Kincaid. But Thorne is the true cost. He was an investment I planned to control, and now he is pure hemorrhage. Finch gestured to the stained copy of the Chronicle. This rag has paralyzed the city council and halted the Northern Wharf project. Every day this continues, I lose $1,000 in demurrage fees, and my reputation, my credit, is damaged beyond measure. The solution is simple, sir, Kincaid replied, his voice flat. We use the law. Thorne violated his contract of indentured service. He is a runaway debtor. We can seize him and the assets of the Jenkins woman, who is guilty of libel and inciting riot. The law is too slow, Kincaid. And the mob is too loud, Finch said, tapping his mahogany desk with a silver pen. We will use a different kind of steel, the kind that cuts through resistance. We need to destroy the press and seize the cargo simultaneously. It must look like an unavoidable accident, or, better yet, the regrettable consequence of a rowdy riot. Finch's plan was simple. Stage an accident at the riverfront where the new rail line was being laid, drawing the bulk of the crowd away from Liberty Street. Then, Kincaid and his men would swoop in, seize the Chronicle office, smash the printing press, the physical embodiment of Clara's liberty, and arrest the leaders. Finch smiled, a cold, humorless expression. We will prove to this territory that the power of capital is greater than the power of words. Meanwhile, at the Chronicle office, Elias, Clara, and Silas McCann were in a hurried council. We can't hold the crowd forever, McCann warned, slamming his fist onto the composing table. Finch will retaliate. He controls the marshal. We can fight off a few thugs, but if they bring the militia, we're done. We need a better weapon than a pistol, Clara said, glancing at the gun she had used the previous day, now locked safely away. We need leverage that hits his balance sheet, not just his pride. We must stop the cargo. Elias unrolled the rough map he had made of the Northern Wharf. The Augustus's Pride will dock late tonight. It carries the rails, the tools, and the opium that Finch plans to use to finance his entire operation. If that cargo is destroyed or seized, his credit collapses. He has mortgaged too much on this one shipment. The wharf is guarded, McCann pointed out. We'd need a small army, and most of these men are miners, not fighters. We don't need an army, Silas, Elias said, a dangerous glint in his eye. We need a diversion and a target. We destroy the cargo. Not the ship, not the men. Just the goods that represent his debt to the world. The conversation turned to strategy, a tense discussion of logistics and risk. They were standing at a crossroads, where two paths offered themselves. One, the legal path, the safe route. Wait for the next council meeting, try to use the courts, and face inevitable delay, corruption, and intimidation. Two, the direct path, the risky route. Take immediate, physical action to seize Finch's most critical asset. Forcing his retreat, they chose the direct path. The time for petitioning was over. The time for action was now. As twilight faded, the small team mobilized. McCann led a group of 50 miners toward the rail depot, their goal being to create a loud, visible distraction at the far end of the wharf. Elias, Clara, and a small, trusted contingent of 5 men would execute the strike on the ship itself. If you are caught, Elias, Finch will use you as an example, Clara warned him, her hand touching his arm. Then I'll be an example of defiance. Clara, I won't return to slavery, Elias bowed. But you must promise me one thing. If I do not return by dawn, you take Thomas and the press, and you disappear. Head north. Do not let Finch silence the paper. The word is the only thing he cannot destroy with steel. Clara nodded, her face etched with fear, but her resolve was absolute. Go, Elias, and remember, the people are listening. The diversion went off exactly as planned. McCann and the miners, armed with picks and shovels, staged a violent protest at the main entrance to the rail depot. They overturned carts, set fire to a stack of old ties, and engaged Kincaid's guards in a loud, chaotic brawl. Kincaid, fearing the loss of Finch's permanent assets, immediately diverted the majority of his security detail to the far end of the wharf. This left the northern wharf, where the Augustus's Pride was quietly offloading its cargo. Almost deserted Elias and his small crew slipped onto the dock. The air was thick with the smell of brine and coal smoke. The enormous clipper ship was a looming black shadow against the moonless sky. The heavy, imported steel rails, the debt measured in steel, were stacked high on the dock. The crucial cargo, the opium, was secured in large, unmarked wooden crates, sitting near the rail cars waiting for transfer. "We don't need to destroy the steel," Elias whispered to his men. "It's too heavy, too risky. We destroy the credit." The opium, working swiftly and silently, they used crowbars to pry open the heavy wooden crates. Inside were hundreds of small, tightly wrapped silk packets. The drug, destined to be sold for immense profit, was Finch's financial lifeline. They hauled the crates to the edge of the wharf and began emptying the packets into the dark, churning water of the Sacramento River. "Every packet is a day of freedom lost to the people in the East," Elias muttered, dumping 2 handfuls of the raw drug into the river. "And every packet lost is a day of freedom gained here." They were nearly finished when the operation went wrong. Kincaid, receiving a frantic message from a panicked customs officer, realized that the attack on the rail depot was merely a feint. He immediately raced back to the northern dock with a small, heavily armed squad. "The crates are open. The cargo is gone. Find them." Kincaid roared. Elias and his men scattered. 2 were caught immediately. Elias, seeing the imminent danger, knew he had to draw Kincaid away from the dock and from the remaining men. He grabbed a lantern and threw it hard against a stack of empty tar barrels near the warehouse wall. The barrels instantly ignited, sending a column of fire and black smoke into the night sky. "Over here, Kincaid. Your debt collector is waiting," Elias shouted, sacrificing his concealment to save his friends. Kincaid turned, recognizing the voice and seeing the light. "Thorne, stop. You'll never escape the debt. Finch will hunt you to Mexico." Elias didn't stop running. He led Kincaid and his men on a desperate chase through the maze of stacked lumber and construction materials. He was running toward the one place he knew offered a chance of survival, Liberty Street. Back on Liberty Street, the crowds had thinned, but a core group was still maintaining a vigil near the Chronicle office. Clara was inside, anxiously cleaning her press, waiting for news. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the far end of the street. It was Elias, running flat out, pursued by Kincaid's armed men. "He's here. He destroyed Finch's cargo." One of the men yelled. The few remaining vigilante miners immediately sprang into action, blocking the street with a hastily erected barricade of barrels and planks. Elias reached the sanctuary of the barricade, stumbling to a stop, utterly exhausted. He turned and faced Kincaid, who was forced to stop at the obstruction. Kincaid drew his rifle. "You are in violation of contract, Thorne. I am seizing you under civil law. Stand down. You are a hired thug for a criminal, Kincaid." Elias spat out, leaning on the barricade. "Finch's progress is built on illegal land sales and opium smuggling. We have the proof." At that moment, the door of the Chronicle office swung open. Clara stood in the doorway, illuminated by the lamp inside, holding the remaining copies of the morning's paper. "The proof is here. The proof is printed," Clara cried out, tossing the papers into the air. The papers drifted down, landing in the hands of the onlookers. They saw the headlines, saw the names, and saw the charges. They saw the price of the steel. The crowd, galvanized by Elias's bravery and Clara's conviction, let out a massive, unified roar. They were no longer a mob. They were a citizenry. Kincaid, seeing the street full of armed, enraged miners, and realizing that firing a weapon now would ignite an all-out war, lowered his rifle in a gesture of frustrated defeat. He couldn't fight the entire city. Elias had reached the crossroads of Liberty Street. He had made his choice. He was no longer Finch's man. He was the people's. He had paid his debt of steel with the destruction of Finch's financial empire. And in doing so, he had become the champion of a new, fragile kind of freedom. The storm had broken, and now, the hard work of building a republic from the ruins of Finch's corruption would begin. The destruction of the opium cargo was not just a financial blow to Augustus Finch. It was a wound to his pride and a direct challenge to the supremacy of his capital. For a man who measured every asset in steel and every debt in human labor, the loss of his crucial financing lifeline was intolerable. His fury was quiet, precise, and more dangerous than any shout. They used the rabble to cover their crime, Finch stated to Kincaid, his security chief, hours after the attack. They stood in the charred ruins of the northern wharf, the air heavy with the smell of wet soot and despair. They think they can win a war of words. We will remind them that capital fights with muscle and law. Finch's strategy was simple. Abandon Sacramento, which was now too hot and volatile, and strike the people where they were weakest at their very source of livelihood, the gold mines. The key lay in the hydraulic mining operations Finch secretly controlled on the upper American River. These massive, earth-rending systems used powerful jets of water to blast entire hillsides, forcing the tailings, the debris, downstream. This process, highly efficient for large-scale capital, polluted the river and buried the traditional claims of the independent miners, the same men who had rallied behind Elias Thorne and Clara Jenkins. The miners are focused on Sacramento, but their survival depends on the river, Finch instructed Kincaid. We will push the hydraulic mining to its limits. We will flood their claims with mud and sediment. We will make the river run brown with sludge, and then red with their blood when they try to stop us. The stage was set for a confrontation far from the city's newspapers, in the rugged, unforgiving canyons of the gold country, a place where law was often just a matter of who had the heaviest gun. Elias Thorne, now fully committed to the miners' cause, knew this counterattack was inevitable. He couldn't stay in Sacramento. His presence endangered Clara and the Chronicle. His debt of steel had been paid in opium, but the debt of leadership was now due. He rode out of Sacramento before dawn, accompanied by Silas Boulder McCarn and a small cadre of trusted miners. Their objective, the Mother Lode District on the American River, where hundreds of independent miners were already struggling against the toxic runoff from Finch's upstream operations. They rode for 2 days, the trail growing steeper and the air growing thinner. When they finally reached the river valley, the scene was catastrophic, not the once clear, life-giving American River was a churning, muddy torrent of industrial effluent. The vast, powerful jets from Finch's Argus cannon hydraulic monitors, mounted high on the bluffs, were visibly tearing into the landscape. The roar of the water cannons was deafening, a monstrous sound that symbolized the uncaring power of capital. The independent miners, the coyote diggers, and river rats were desperate. Their sluice boxes were clogged, their small claims ruined by the suffocating sludge. "Look at this," McCann choked out, scooping up a handful of thick, reddish-brown mud. "Finch isn't just taking the gold. He's killing the river. He's destroying the land for 100 years. Elias surveyed the scene, his gaze settling on the bluffs where the powerful cannons were mounted. He recognized the heavy, iron-reinforced hoses, the steel that Finch used to enforce his will. "The cannons are the key," Elias said. "They are powered by high-pressure pumps deep in the canyon. Finch knows the miners won't dare attack the heavy machinery, too exposed on the bluffs. He thinks he can use the river as his weapon. Finch had anticipated resistance. The area around the hydraulic pumps and the access roads was now guarded by a large contingent of Kincaid's men, a mix of hired thugs and disgraced former soldiers. All paid well in silver to suppress the uprising. They were armed with repeating rifles and carried no ethical qualms. The stage was the deep, constricted river canyon. The battlefield was the river itself. Elias called a council of the independent miners, gathering them in a hidden grove away from the roar of the cannons. They were a diverse, ragged group: Irish, Chinese, Mexican, and native-born Americans, all united by their shared enemy and the threat to their livelihood. Finch wants a massacre far from Sacramento, Elias told them, speaking calmly but with absolute clarity. He wants to turn the river red to send a message. We will not fight them on the ground they choose. We will fight them on the ground we choose, the system itself. The plan was daring and relied on Elias's mechanical knowledge gleaned from his time at Finch's Depot. 1. Diversion. A small group of miners, led by McCann, would stage a visible but contained attack on the road leading to the main pump station, drawing Kincaid's guards into the open. 2. Sabotage. Elias and a smaller, highly mobile team would sneak into the heart of the pump station and disable the main engine, the power source for the devastating water cannons. 3. The choke point. If the engine could not be permanently disabled, they would target the specialized valves and fittings that directed the high-pressure water through the steel pipes. The target was not the men, but the steel infrastructure of Tyranny. The night of the strike was cold and moonless, adding to the atmosphere of foreboding. The roar of the water cannons continued unabated, constant reminder of the devastation being wrought. McCann's single quotes S diversion began with a volley of strategically aimed shots and the controlled burning of a small supply shack. Kincaid, seeing the fire and hearing the shots, immediately committed the bulk of his force to securing the main access road, just as Elias had predicted. Elias and his small team, moving like ghosts through the dense chaparral, reached the pump station, a huge, noisy wooden shed housing a massive steam engine and a terrifying array of thick, bolted steel pipes. Inside, the heat was intense, and the noise was deafening. The air tasted of oil and hot metal. 2 guards were posted at the main engine. Elias signaled his men. They moved in swiftly. There was a brief, silent struggle, ending quickly and brutally with the guards subdued. Elias immediately went to work on the steam engine. He knew a direct attack would only lead to an explosion, killing them all. He needed to cripple it quietly. His eyes scanned the complex machinery, finally settling on the drive belt tensioner. With a heavy wrench and his intimate knowledge of the mechanics of progress, Elias expertly loosened the crucial bolts holding the tensioner. He was not destroying the engine. He was introducing a subtle, systemic failure. With a final sickening wrenching sound, the massive leather drive belt that powered the pump slipped violently off the flywheel, slapping against the housing with tremendous force. The huge steam engine, no longer moving the immense pump, immediately began to speed up, its rhythmic hiss-clack-clack turning into a terrifying runaway whir. The roar of the water cannons on the bluffs immediately sputtered and died. A chilling silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the screaming. Accelerating engine. Elias and his men fled the pump house, just as the first of Kincaid's men, drawn by the sudden silence, approached. Kincaid arrived at the pump house to find his engine screaming itself to pieces. The entire multi-million-dollar operation paralyzed. The momentary silence was over, replaced by the chaotic sounds of a disorganized firefight. As the miners clashed with the guards, Kincaid knew this was the moment. He had to recapture the initiative, or Finch's entire operation would collapse. He grabbed his largest repeating rifle and rallied his men. Forget the engine. They are trying to seize the canyon. We pushed them back to the river. No prisoners. The engagement turned into a desperate, brutal chase through the tangled canyon floor. It was a close-quarters battle, fought with knives, pistols, and the raw, desperate fury of men fighting for their homes against men fighting for a paycheck. Elias was caught in the thick of it. He saw the flash of gunfire, heard the agonizing screams of wounded men, and felt the sickening impact of bullets hitting the trees around him. The river of blood began to flow in one desperate charge. Elias came face to face with a massive armed guard. They wrestled fiercely, falling down an embankment and into a shallow, mud-choked tributary, a small, crimson stream flowing into the larger. Brown River. Elias fought not with military skill, but with the desperate strength of a man fighting for his soul. He fought for the future Clara was trying to print, for the promise he had made his father. He overpowered the guard, but not before taking a glancing blow to his head that sent him reeling. He staggered back, exhausted, dizzy, and covered in mud and blood. Upstream, McCann and his men, despite taking heavy losses, had managed to push Kincaid's remaining forces toward a narrow gorge, natural choke point where the river ran deep and fast. Kincaid, seeing his forces decimated and his objective lost, knew he had to retreat or be overwhelmed. Fall back to the main road. Kincaid shouted, desperately trying to organize a retreat, but the miners were everywhere, surrounding them, driven by vengeance for their ruined claims and their lost comrades. McCann, battered and bleeding from a bullet graze, stood over the gorge. "This is the end of the line, Kincaid. You tried to kill our river, and now the river claims you." The remaining fight was short and savage. Kincaid, seeing his men falling and the situation hopeless, made a final desperate move. He threw down his rifle, turned, and plunged into the frigid, churning water of the American River, hoping the current would carry him to safety downstream. By the time the sun rose, painting the canyon walls in stark shades of orange and pink, the fighting was over. The roar of the steam engine had mercifully died down, silenced by its own self-destruction. The pump house was a smoking wreck. Kincaid was gone, swallowed by the river, and the canyon floor was a testament to the brutal cost of liberty. The remaining miners, bloodied and mournful, gathered their dead. The victory was immense, but the price was devastating. Elias, receiving hasty first aid for his head wound, surveyed the carnage. The river, having claimed Kincaid, was still brown with the industrial waste, but the flow of blood had stopped. The immediate threat from Finch's steel cannons was neutralized. "We stopped the cannons," McCann said, leaning heavily on his shovel. "We stopped the flooding. But what now, Elias? Finch will bring the army. He'll bring the law. He will bring the law, but we have destroyed his proof and his profit," Elias said, though his voice was raw with grief. "He no longer has the credit to fund an army. He is crippled." Elias knew the battle wasn't over, but they had bought time, and time was what Clara needed. 3 days later, Elias returned to Sacramento, hailed by the miners as their champion. He went straight to the Sacramento Chronicle office. Clara rushed out to meet him, her face a mixture of relief and horror at his battered appearance. "The river, did it flow?" she asked quietly, knowing the cost. Elias nodded, his eyes weary. "It flowed, Clara, but the water cannons are silent. The cost was high, but we stopped Finch's empire here." Clara didn't waste a moment on mourning. She pulled him inside, where the scent of ink and paper filled the air. She handed him a freshly printed sheet. It was a special edition of the Chronicle. The front page was dominated by the headline, The rivers of blood, a price of Finch's progress paid in the mother lode. Below the headline was a detailed, meticulously written account of the hydraulic war, naming Kincaid, exposing Finch's use of armed thugs, and framing the entire event as a self-defense action by the citizenry. She had already sent couriers carrying the story and the names of the dead to the territorial capital and the San Francisco papers. Clara looked at Elias, her blue eyes shining with fierce purpose. The steel is broken, Elias. Now we use the paper to destroy the name. Finch will be forced to choose, face criminal charges for murder and land fraud, or cut his losses and abandon the territory. The cost of the Western Star had been paid in blood on the banks of the American River. Elias had lost his peace, his innocence, and nearly his life. But in the fire and the mud, he had forged not gold, but leadership, the foundation for the free society he sought. The battle was won. Now, the long, difficult task of building the new future began. The winter of 1856 settled over Sacramento, bringing not just a damp chill, but a profound, unusual silence. The political battles were over, the financial siege was broken, and the last of the secrets had been confessed. The cannonade of conflict, both public and private, had ceased. What remained was the stark, physical reality of the work. The trenches for the Public Waterworks Initiative scarred the streets of Sacramento like fresh wounds, stretching for miles in a testament to Elias Thorne's uncompromising vision. The city was a vast, open construction site. Elias had kept his promise. The morning after his confession to Clara, he had presented his full written disclosure regarding his father's theft to the city council. The immediate fallout was chaotic. The political shrapnel, the Moss-Kent faction, though defeated financially, seized upon the revelation with rabid fervor. Senator Moss, emerging from semi-retirement, led the attack. This is not integrity. This is manipulation, Moss thundered in a special council session. The architect of this city admits his foundation is built on the shame of a thief. The bonds are invalid. The waterworks is a monument to deception. The support Elias had painstakingly cultivated wavered. The moderate council members, who had risked their reputations to vote for the waterworks, suddenly faced constituents who feared they had been duped by a clever rogue. But Elias had anticipated the attack. He had ensured that the truth was the weapon, not the liability. Clara, simultaneously, published Elias's full statement in the Sacramento Chronicle, framed not as a scandal, but as a founding act of moral transparency. Her editorial was a masterpiece of political jiu-jitsu, arguing that a man who voluntarily confessed his past shame was far more trustworthy than a politician who hid his present crimes. The public reaction was mixed, but ultimately decisive. The working class, who had suffered under generations of hidden corruption, respected Elias's brutal honesty. They were less concerned with the father's past sin than the son's present courage. The council voted, narrowly, to allow Elias to retain his position, provided the waterworks project remained perfectly on schedule and free of even the smallest hint of financial malfeasance. The storm had passed, but Elias now worked under an unforgiving spotlight. His freedom was conditional, his success dependent on the perfection of his construction. The labor of peace Elias threw himself into the work with a relentless intensity that worried Clara. He supervised every trench, inspected every joint, and worked alongside the laborers, often not returning home until the early hours of the morning, covered in mud and exhaustion. He was building the city, but he was also rebuilding himself. The physical labor of creating something clean, lasting, and tangible, something that would bring health and order to the city, was his ongoing penance and his peace. One frigid, late afternoon, Elias was deep in a trench, inspecting the laying of a massive, heavy iron pipe, the very kind of steel that once symbolized his death. He was working with a crew of exhausted Irish laborers, the air thick with steam rising from their breathing. The work was painstaking, requiring precise alignment of the massive joints. "Thorne, this joint is off a half-inch," roared Foreman O'Rourke, a massive, stern man with a chronic cough. "If the joint is off, the seal will fail in 5 years." Elias shouted back, dropping into the mud-filled trench. "We do not build for 5 years, O'Rourke. We build for 50. Move the winch, slowly." He reset the collar. Elias spent the next hour working shoulder to shoulder with the laborers, his hands raw, correcting the error. He didn't order. He worked. He demonstrated a physical competence and an unyielding commitment to quality that earned him the silent, deep respect of the working crews. They were not building for him. They were building with him. As dusk fell, O'Rourke wiped his brow and spat into the mud. "It'll hold, Thorne. It'll hold forever." "Good," Elias said, climbing out of the trench, his body aching with satisfying exhaustion. "That is the only inheritance worth leaving." Clara watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and quiet sorrow. The man who had confessed his soul to her was now physically distant, pouring every ounce of his energy into the pipe and the trench. Their love, sealed in the emotional heat of confession, had defined its sustaining rhythm in the cold, quiet reality of construction. She understood his need for perpetual motion, his fear that if he rested, the ghosts of the past would resurface. But she also knew that the republic they had founded needed a whole man, not a haunted hero. She took to bringing him supper at the work sites. One night, she found him sitting alone in a small, temporary office shack, reviewing a complex engineering diagram by the faint light of a kerosene lamp. "You'll ruin your eyes." "Elias," she said softly, setting a steaming tin of stew on his desk, "I have to check the pressure points." "Clara, Kent's men are looking for any single failure they can exploit. If one joint bursts, the whole project is tainted," he explained. Not looking up, Clara sat down beside him, placing her hand gently on his mud-caked sleeve. "I ran the numbers again today. We are under budget, and we are ahead of schedule. You are doing this perfectly, Elias. You have proven your integrity to the city." "It's not the city I need to prove it to," Elias finally admitted, laying down his pen. "It's the dock workers. It's the men my father ruined. Every foot of pipe laid is a foot further away from that shame. And every foot of pipe is a foot closer to a life where you allow yourself rest," Clara insisted. She leaned in, her voice low. "I told you, the ultimate atonement is not endless work. It is life. It is accepting the peace you earned." She knew she couldn't simply command him to stop. She had to shift his focus from the debt of the past to the promise of the future. "We received a new dispatch from Maeve O'Connell today," Clara said, gently steering the conversation. Maeve, the sister of the dead miner Finn O'Connell, was now a vital part of the political structure, successfully running a small reform school for immigrant children in the north. She reports that the children are thriving. Clara continued. "The school needs more funding, not just for books, but for a permanent structure, a proper library. We need to raise funds, Elias. Funds for the next generation's foundation." Elias listened, his eyes finally lifting from the grim engineering diagram. Funding a library building an enduring foundation of knowledge was a positive, future-oriented debt, a project worthy of his skill. He saw the shift in her eyes. She wasn't asking him to abandon his hammer, but to change his focus. Asterisk, a library, Elias mused, a faint smile touching his lips. A house built not of steel, but of ideas. That is a project I can start immediately. The next morning, Elias was back in the trenches, but his focus had shifted. He was still the perfectionist, but he worked with a different kind of urgency, the urgency of legacy. That night, Elias came home earlier than he had in months. He was still dirty, still exhausted, but his eyes were clear. He found Clara in the parlor, mending a tear in one of his heavy work shirts. I found the perfect site for Maeve's library. Clara, he said, pouring himself the lukewarm water they still favored. It needs a double foundation. The soil is soft there. I'll start drawing the plans tomorrow. He looked at her, his gaze finally settling on her not as his political partner, but as his anchor. He walked over and knelt beside her, resting his head against her shoulder, the raw, profound exhaustion of his soul finally finding rest. I'm tired. Clara, he confessed softly, a simplicity that meant more than any declaration of love. Rest. My founder, Clara whispered, running her fingers through his hair. The city is stable. The press is running. The debt is paid. The house of ambition needs its architect to sleep. He closed his eyes, allowing the long, cold silence after the conflict, the quiet after the cannonade, to finally seep into his spirit. The work of building the Republic was endless, but the war within himself, the struggle to justify his existence, was finally over. He slept, deeply and without fear, his quiet peace earned not by gold, but by integrity and the unyielding foundation of his shared ambition with Clara. They had built a republic, 1 foot of pipe and one painful truth at a time. The inheritance was peace, bought at the highest price. The early winter air in Sacramento was frigid, the cold sinking deep into the bones, a stark contrast to the heat of the recent conflict. The air was cleaner now. The hydraulic cannons were silent, and the American River, though still scarred, ran less like sludge and more like water. The battle had been won. But the victory tasted of Ashdot Elias Thorne sat in the newly renovated back room of the Sacramento Chronicle, which was now fortified with sandbags and armed guards, a grim necessity of their continued freedom. He stared at a half-finished letter lying on the small wooden table. It was addressed to the only family he had left in Baltimore, his elderly aunt, who still ran a small, genteel dry goods shop on the harbor. The letter was nearly 3 pages long, but the final crucial sentence remained unwritten. Asterisk, double quotes, ... The life out here is hard. Dear Aunt, harder than the tannery, harder than the voyage. But it is a life where a man owns his own failures and his own successes. I have found my piece of ground, not through gold, but through a far more costly measure, the defense of justice. Yet the price has been heavy. I have seen things no man should see, and I have done things I never thought myself capable of. He picked up the pen, intending to write about the final confrontation with Kincaid, the desperate fight in the mud, and the sight of the miners' bodies, but the words refused to form. How could he convey the smell of gunpowder and blood to a woman who worried about the price of imported lace? The true cost of the Western Star was not measured in dollars, but in the loss of innocence and the weight of the lives sacrificed for this new republic they were building. Elias had achieved his goal of owning his fate, but the man who arrived in California was irrevocably gone. The debt of steel was paid, but the debt of grief remained. He set the pen down. The letter would remain unsent, a final, necessary cut of the ties that bound him to the sheltered world of the East. Meanwhile, 50 miles away, in the relative safety of his hastily secured San Francisco office, Augustus Finch was also confronting an unbearable cost. Finch was not bankrupt. His holdings spanned the entire continent, but his California venture, the one he had planned as his crowning legacy, was in ruins. The destruction of the opium cargo had triggered an immediate credit crisis. His bondholders in New York, spooked by the stories of violence and the sudden lack of high-value collateral, were demanding repayment. The news, spread rapidly by Clara's network of couriers, had reached the East, painting Finch not as a titan of progress, but as a ruthless criminal involved in murder and drug smuggling. He sat alone, staring at a massive framed portrait of his father, the founder of the Finch Empire. They are barbarians. Father, Finch whispered into the silent room, his voice strained. They fight with mud and chaos. They do not understand the necessity of order. His solicitor, Mr. Alistair, now frail and visibly nervous, entered the office. Sir, the warrants. They have been issued. The territorial marshal, under pressure from the courts, has issued an indictment for conspiracy and an accessory to murder concerning the American River skirmish. The miners provided compelling testimony, thanks to that chronicle woman. Finch slowly turned, his face pale with cold fury. Indictment? Me? They dare use my own law against me? The cost of defense would be ruinous. Mr. Finch, you would have to appear in a Sacramento court before a frontier jury, Alistair said gently. The risk is too high. The name, the family name. The ultimate debt Finch faced was not monetary. It was the debt of reputation. The name of Finch, synonymous with American industry and respectability, could not be dragged through a frontier murder trial. His carefully constructed life was collapsing under the weight of his own ruthless ambition. Finch walked to his window, looking out over the nascent city, a beautiful bay, a perfect port that he had failed to conquer. The problem is not the gold, Alistair. The problem is the people. They refuse to be managed. They refuse to accept their role in the machine. He picked up a telegram on his desk, crumpled it, and threw it into the fireplace. It was an urgent request from his brother Silas in New York, begging him to cease his legal pursuit of the miners and admit defeat. Finch took a moment, then straightened his vest. He had made his decision. He would cut his losses. He would abandon California, retreat to New York, and use his vast resources to crush his bondholders and rebuild his reputation. He would win the war on the familiar ground of Wall Street, leaving the messy, unpredictable West behind. Draft a final order, Alistair, Finch commanded, his voice cold and resolute. Sell off all remaining rail ties, properties, and equipment to the highest bidder. Liquidate all assets. I want nothing left in this savage territory that bears the name Finch. We are done with the Western Star. He had chosen progress, his Eastern Empire, over liberty, the frontier conquest. Back in Sacramento, the news arrived 2 days later via a hastily scribbled note from a sympathetic contact in San Francisco. Augustus, Finch was withdrawing. The immediate reaction was disbelief, followed by an explosion of joyous celebration. The fear that had gripped the town was replaced by a giddy sense of victory and autonomy. The miners held a torchlight parade down Liberty Street, chanting Elias's name and hoisting Clara's press onto a flatbed wagon as a symbol of their freedom. But for Elias and Clara, the victory was sober. They knew the retreat of Finch created a political vacuum, not a permanent peace. That evening, they sat alone in the Chronicle office, reviewing the final tallies of the damage. 3 miners dead, several injured, the cost of rebuilding the pump house, and the legal fees necessary to secure the land titles against future corporate assaults. He is gone. Elias, Clara said, running her hand across the cool, solid iron of her printing press. We won. The debt is settled. He is gone, but the system he created remains. Elias countered, spreading out a map of the territory. His steel rails are still here, his land titles still unsettled. The corrupt council members are in hiding, but their laws remain on the books. We fought the battle, Clara, but we haven't built the government. Then we start tomorrow, Clara declared, her blue eyes shining with exhaustion and purpose. You know the land, you know the people, and you know the enemy's tactics better than any man here. We need a political platform. We need laws that favor the common man, not the distant speculator. We need to turn this crossroads of violence into a foundation of true liberty. She saw the shadow of grief and weariness in his face and knew the weight he carried. You earned this. Elias, you paid the debt of the past with the blood of the present. Now you must decide what future you will build. She urged. Elias finally picked up the unsent letter to his aunt. He read the rambling, incomplete sentences one last time. He realized the letter was never meant for her. It was a conversation with his own past, a final attempt to justify the violent, harsh man he had become. He folded the letter and walked to the iron stove, built from a discarded part of Finch's ruined pump. He opened the hatch and dropped the paper in. The heat instantly consumed the thin paper, and the words Baltimore, tannery, shame. That vanished in a puff of smoke dot with that final act of letting go. The last vestige of New England, the last constraint of his old life, was gone. He walked back to Clara, who was already meticulously setting the type for the next day's front page. What is tomorrow's headline? Elias asked. Clara smiled, the first genuine, unburdened smile he had seen since the chaos began. It is the call to build a new council. It is the announcement of a citizens' committee for territorial integrity, and it needs a voice, a man who understands the price of steel and the value of a free vote. She pushed a small, handwritten manifesto across the desk, a platform for land reform, fair mining laws, and democratic government. Elias read the proposal, his eyes scanning the practical, deeply felt demands for justice. It was everything he had come west to find. This is not a letter, Clara, Elias said, tapping the manifesto. This is the promise we fought for. Then let the promise be heard, Elias. Will you run? Elias looked at the map, at the scarred land, at the heavy, demanding machinery of the press. He looked at Clara, his indispensable ally, his mirror of resolve. He knew the fight had only shifted ground, from the riverbanks to the assembly hall. Yes, Elias said, his voice strong and clear. The Western Star demands more than gold. It demands governance. The debt is paid. Now we begin the construction of liberty. He had finally crossed his own personal crossroads. The frontier had stripped him bare, forced him into violence, but in return, it had given him purpose, a future, and a foundation of steel and ink to build it upon. The year was 1854. Sacramento was no longer a chaotic mining camp. It was a burgeoning capital, eager for stability and legitimate governance. Yet, the foundations of this new structure were inherently volatile, built upon the ruins of corporate greed and the raw, untamed ambition of thousands of new arrivals. Augustus Finch was gone, but his shadow remained. His liquidated assets, the land deeds, the warehouses, and even sections of the rail track had been snapped up by a dozen hungry speculators, creating a new, decentralized network of corruption that was harder to fight than a single titan. Elias Thorne had stepped fully into the political arena. His war hero status and reputation for integrity had propelled him to the forefront of the Citizens Committee for Territorial Integrity. His goal was ambitious, to move beyond vigilante justice and establish a legitimate, incorruptible local government. The campaign headquarters was, fittingly, the Sacramento Chronicle office. Clara Jenkins was not just the editor. She was the chief strategist, propagandist, and legal mind of the entire movement. She knew that to build a lasting house of ambition, they needed not only good intentions, but also unassailable leverage and public opinion. They call you the carpenter candidate. Elias, Clara observed one evening, watching him tirelessly rework a proposed bill on mining safety regulations. They mean it as a slight that you are merely a laborer, but it is your strength. You build things that last. I'm tired of destroying, Clara, Elias confessed, rubbing the perpetual ache in his neck. The physical scars from the canyon battle had faded, but the psychological ones were deep. It's easy to tear down a house built on lies. It's infinitely harder to construct one of truth. Their immediate objective was to elect a new, clean city council and a territorial delegate who would champion their cause in Washington, D.C., a move that would grant the territory stability and, crucially, land ownership rights for small settlers. The opposition was swift and effective. It was led by Senator Thaddeus Moss, a longtime fixture in territorial politics, a man who saw the new Carpenter candidate as a dangerous working-class upstart. Moss was not a titan like Finch. He was a vulture, feeding on the political carcass Finch had left behind. Moss controlled the city's established banks, the legitimate liquor and land lobbies, and had the tacit support of the remaining corrupt judiciary. Moss's campaign was brutal. His newspaper, the rival Western Standard, relentlessly attacked Elias. The slander was thick. Thorne is a runaway debtor, referencing his old contract with Finch. The Canyon Killer, exploiting the bloodshed at the American River, a tool of the anarchist press, aiming directly at Clara. The greatest challenge was the financial cost of the campaign. Moss had the support of the banks, while Elias's funding came from the meager contributions of miners and small business owners. We are fighting gold with pennies. Elias, Clara worried, counting the small, ragged bills in their campaign chest. Moss is buying up every favorable newspaper ad in San Francisco. We can't buy the press, Clara, but we own the narrative, Elias declared. We fight them with transparency. Elias held massive open-air rallies where he personally detailed every cent of the campaign's finances, listing every contributor, no matter how small. He turned the debt accusation into a symbol of his independence, stating, "I paid my debt to the capitalist with my labor and my defiance. Now, I owe my allegiance only to the people." His honesty resonated. The working class, tired of smoke-filled rooms and hidden ledgers, flocked to his banner. The ambition Elias possessed was not for personal enrichment, but for the creation of a system that could not be bought, an ambition the people finally recognized as their own. The campaign reached a crucial inflection point when Moss attempted to crush their financial lifeline, the largest landowner in the territory, a man named Jeremiah Vance, who held the key to several contested riverfront properties, publicly endorsed Elias and offered a significant loan to the committee. A week later, the Western Standard ran a sensational story accusing Vance of illegal profiteering and demanding the immediate seizure of his land titles. The attack was baseless, designed purely to intimidate. Vance and starve Elias's. Campaign.Elias knew the attack was a calculated risk by Moss. He needed to prove that the House of Ambition they were building could withstand this kind of political siege. Elias and Clara visited Vance, finding the old man shaken but furious. "They want me to retract my endorsement." "Elias," Vance said, gesturing to the papers, "they want to prove that no one can stand up to their financial network." "You are right, Mr. Vance," Elias said, "but we can use this. Moss is using the press to create a legal crisis. We will use the press to create a political shield." Clara immediately drafted a blistering editorial exposing Moss's financial ties to the very banks pressuring Vance. Elias followed up by holding a massive rally on Vance's contested property, turning the threatened foreclosure into a public defense of property rights against political corruption. They attacked Mr. Vance because he dares to support the common man. Elias roared to the thousands assembled, "If they can seize his legal property with lies, what hope do any of you have of keeping your hard-won claims?" The move was brilliant. The public outcry was so fierce and immediate that the local bank, fearing a run on its deposits, publicly disavowed Moss's actions, effectively isolating the senator. Vance's loan was secured, and the momentum shifted decisively in Elias's favor. However, Victory in the ballot box did not guarantee power. Elias, along with his slate of reformers, swept the city council election. He was elected as the leading voice on the council and immediately set about fulfilling his promise to dismantle the corrupt framework left behind by Finch. The greatest challenge was the Land Titles Bill. For years, the vast, rich tracts of California land were held by a confusing web of Spanish grants, federal claims, and fraudulent deeds, the very chaos Finch and Moss had exploited. Elias proposed a bill that would force an immediate, transparent survey and registration of all land, granting secure ownership to current settlers and small miners. This bill threatened every speculator and wealthy landowner in the territory. Elias had built his house of ambition, but the internal structure was a weak dot in a tense council meeting. Surrounded by newly elected colleagues, some genuinely supportive, others secretly aligned with the Moss faction, Elias presented the bill. A newly elected councilman named Silas Kent, a smooth-talking lawyer who had run on our reform platform, immediately stood up to oppose double quotes Mr. Thorne. This bill is a noble endeavor, but it is deeply flawed. It is an unconstitutional government overreach. Kent argued, using sophisticated legal language that easily confused the working-class council members. It opens the door to endless litigation and economic destabilization. We need stability, not revolution. Kent's argument was powerful because it sounded reasonable. He wasn't defending corruption. He was defending order. This was the new, sophisticated face of opposition, one that used Elias's own desire for stability against him. The debate raged for hours. Elias, the carpenter who understood material and foundation, struggled to articulate the complex legal principles necessary to counter Kent's rhetoric. During a break, a defeated Elias retreated to the hallway. Clara met him, her face grim. Kent is Moss's new protege, she revealed, handing Elias a hastily written note. He is using Finch's old playbook, divide and confuse. He's promising key infrastructure projects to swing the undecided councilman. I can build the infrastructure, Clara, but I can't untangle his legal knots fast enough. Elias admitted, frustrated. My knowledge is of wood and steel, not legal statute. Then use your knowledge of wood and steel, Clara urged. You said it yourself. The foundation must be stronger than the load. Kent is talking about laws. You must talk about life. You must remind them what this city is built on. Elias returned to the council floor, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The vote was about to be called, and Kent had clearly swayed enough votes to defeat the bill. Mr. Kent speaks of order and stability. Elias began, his voice cutting through the expectant silence. He speaks of property rights and legal standing. But I ask you, councilman, to look out that window. He walked to the window and pointed to the street below, to the muddy tracks of the wagons, the half-finished buildings, and the hard-working faces of the people. What is the foundation of this city? Is it a lawyer's document, or is it the sweat of the miner who dug the cellar? Is it the banker's ledger, or the courage of the man who ran off Finch's thugs? Elias pulled a small, rough-hewn piece of iron from his pocket, a fragment of the pump he had sabotaged at the American River. This is the steel of Finch's progress. It failed because it was built on a foundation of lies and theft. If we vote down this land bill, we are building our new house on the same rotting planks. We are telling every man who fought for this territory that his land is not his, but belongs to the next speculator who can hire a clever lawyer like Mr. Kent. Elias slammed the fragment of steel onto the table. I am a carpenter. I know that without a secure foundation, the whole house collapses. Secure the land now, councilman. Pass this bill, and we build a house that lasts. Vote it down, and you build a tombstone for democracy in California. The silence was profound. Elias hadn't won the legal argument, But he had won the moral one. He had stripped away Kent's political rhetoric and exposed the dangerous choice beneath. When the vote was finally called, the result was a narrow victory. The Land Titles Bill passed. Elias had won the first crucial battle of construction. He had secured the foundation of his political house. But as he looked across the floor at the cold, calculating smile of Silas Kent, he knew the ambition to rule was a hungry, ceaseless beast. The house was built, but the enemies were now inside the walls. The air in Sacramento, in the spring of 1855, was thick with the scent of ambition, but it was now overlaid with the perfume of wealth. Elias Thorne's Land Titles Bill had secured the claims of the common settlers, ensuring the stability of the territory, but it had simultaneously created a new, wealthy class of landowners and merchants who were eager to assert their dominance. The new power brokers needed a society, a place to display their fortunes and forge alliances. The result was the inaugural Territorial Charity Ball, held in the newly constructed Grand Hall of the Golden West Hotel. This was the new battlefield. It was here, beneath glittering chandeliers and amidst the swirl of silk and lace, that the true political lines of the new California were being drawn. Elias, now a leading figure on the city council, was obligated to attend. He wore a rented, stiff black coat that felt like a uniform, a sharp contrast to the familiar comfort of his work shirt. He felt profoundly out of place, a carpenter among architects of fortune. His ally, Clara Jenkins, was equally uncomfortable, but strategically essential. She had traded her ink-stained apron for a modest but elegant blue gown. She saw the ballroom not as a place for dancing, but as a map of the enemy's formation. "Look at the room, Elias," Clara murmured, leaning close. "Every woman is a walking deed of ownership, and every man is a potential vote." The political war didn't end with the land bill. It moved from the ground to the parquet. The immediate threat was still Senator Thaddeus Moss and his new political weapon, Silas Kent. Moss was not present. He was too much of a relic. But Kent was the picture of effortless charm, gliding across the floor, effortlessly shaking hands and sowing seeds of doubt about Elias's radical plans for public investment. Kent is aiming for the territorial governor's seat next term, Elias noted grimly. He's using these new wealthy landowners, the men whose fortunes were stabilized, by my bill to fund his campaign to dismantle it. The battle for control of the new House of Ambition was on. The greatest challenge facing Elias's Reform Council was the Public Waterworks Initiative. Sacramento desperately needed a modern public sanitation system to replace the muddy, disease-ridden trenches that plagued the city. Elias planned to finance it through a small, uniform tax on all property, a burden the new wealthy elite desperately wished to avoid. Kent was using the ball to spread a powerful counter-narrative that Elias was a socialist who intended to seize private wealth for unnecessary government projects. Elias had to find a way to counter Kent's influence without resorting to the mudslinging of the Western Standard. He needed a wedge. That wedge appeared in the form of Genevieve Dumont. Genevieve was the daughter of Antoine Dumont, a French émigré and railroad investor who had bought up most of Augustus Finch's liquidated rail assets. She was 25, stunning and utterly captivating. Her dress was the most expensive in the room, and she moved with an air of sophisticated command that drew every eye. Elias watched as Kent immediately monopolized her attention, their conversation long and animated. He knew that an alliance between Kent's political machine and Dumont's capital would be devastating. "You must cut in, Elias," Clara instructed, her voice low and urgent. "You must get to her. Dumont's rail lines are the key to the entire public waterworks initiative. They'll need his rights of way to lay the new mains." Elias hesitated. He hated the required artifice of social combat. I wouldn't know how to speak to a woman like that, Clara. I speak the language of blueprints and lumber. Then speak the language of power, Elias, Clara insisted. That's the only language they understand here. Asterisk, with a deep breath, Elias crossed the floor. He approached Kent and Genevieve with a directness that stunned the surrounding guests. Mr. Kent, Elias said, cutting into their conversation without preamble. I apologize for the interruption, but Miss Dumont, I require a moment of your time regarding the Public Waterworks Initiative. It concerns the future value of your father's assets. Kent bristled, his charm instantly replaced by hostility. Councilman Thorne, Miss Dumont, and I were discussing matters of mutual investment, not your socialist schemes. Genevieve, however, looked intrigued. She smiled, a dazzling, challenging expression. On the contrary, Mr. Kent, Mr. Thorne's initiatives are exactly what concern my father's assets. Councilman Thorne, you may cut in. Elias was a clumsy dancer, but he was a focused man. As they moved through the crowd, he didn't flatter or flirt. He talked business. Your father now owns the rail assets abandoned by Augustus Finch, Elias stated, holding her at a proper distance. Finch's biggest failing was seeing only the tracks, not the cities they served. My public waterworks will make Sacramento a stable, modern city, a hub for commerce. Your father's rail lines will be worth 10 times more when they service a growing, healthy population. A compelling argument, Councilman, Genevieve replied, her eyes assessing him, not his coat. But Mr. Kent offers my father assurances of low tax burdens. Your plan offers an immediate expense. Kent offers stability for the wealthy. I offer growth for the city, Elias countered, his voice earnest. And if your father denies the right-of-way for the water mains, I will be forced to use the power of the new council to condemn the land. It will be expensive, messy, and ruin his reputation before he even starts. Genevieve stopped dancing, pulling him toward a quiet alcove draped in velvet curtains. The conversation had instantly moved from the ballroom floor to the shadow of power. You are surprisingly direct, Mr. Thorne. You don't hide your ambition. My ambition is for this city to thrive. I don't build my house on hidden mortgages, Miss Dumont. I build it on transparent foundations, Elias said, looking directly into her eyes. A long moment passed. Genevieve saw the raw, uncompromising integrity that had drawn the hour. Miners to him, a force entirely different from the practiced smoothness of Kent. She wasn't accustomed to men treating her as an equal in a debate about municipal infrastructure. My father respects strength. Mr. Thorne, send me the details on the required land access, and I will present your case not as a burden, but as an investment in the future stability of his entire California portfolio. Elias felt a surge of success. He had won the first skirmish. Thank you, Miss Dumont. You have secured the city's health, he said, a genuine smile finally breaking through his weariness. Do not thank me, Councilman, she replied, a cool amusement in her voice. I am merely securing my inheritance. And perhaps I am curious to see a man who risks ruin for a principle. The night took a personal turn as the political tension eased. Elias returned to Clara, who was watching from the sidelines with a tight, unreadable expression. Victory, I assume? Clara asked, her voice slightly strained. The Dumont right-of-way is secured. The backbone of the waterworks is safe, Elias confirmed. You look tired, Clara. You should rest. Rest is a luxury for the idle, she replied, though she immediately regretted the sharpness in her tone. The truth was the intense, shared struggle of the past 2 years, the long nights working over the press, the reliance on each other for survival, had forged a bond between them that was deeper than friendship or partnership. Elias was driven by the loss of his past, Clara by the defense of her press and her future. They were two halves of the same ambition, But seeing Elias with Genevieve, a woman who moved so easily in this world of wealth and sophistication, ignited a complex, painful emotion in Clara. Jealousy, rooted in fear. She feared the pull of that world. A world Elias was now entering. A world that might make her the ink-stained firebrand. Redundant as they spoke, Silas Kent sauntered past, his smile oily and knowing. Ah, the reformed trinity, Kent purred, nodding to Elias and Clara. Councilman Thorne, you certainly have a talent for winning over influential women. You have the press on your side. And now the Dumont fortune. A formidable combination. Kent's eyes lingered on Clara, an unspoken implication hanging in the air. Which woman is the true alliance, and which is the discard? Clara stiffened, but Elias, weary of the subtle warfare, stepped forward. My alliances are based on principle, Kent. Miss Jenkins and I are partners in building an honest city. Something you wouldn't understand. Partners, indeed, Kent said smoothly. But the ballroom has many shadows, Thorne, and secrets cast the longest ones. Kent's casual cruelty hit its mark. He knew that the close, unorthodox partnership between Elias and Clara was already the subject of gossip. Gossip that could destroy their moral credibility with the conservative factions of the city. Later, as the orchestra played a slow waltz, Elias found himself unexpectedly approached by Genevieve again. Mr. Thorne, I observe that your presence here creates a great deal of unrest, she noted, watching Kent's furious gaze from across the room. Unrest is usually the first sign of necessary change, Elias replied. And Miss Jenkins, Genevieve continued, her voice soft. She is your conscience, Councilman. That is a dangerous thing to bring into politics. Elias met her gaze. She is my partner, and she is the reason this city has a voice. Genevieve studied him, but she belongs to the old war, the soot, the struggle, the press. I offer you the future, Elias. A life where power is exerted in drawing rooms, not on muddy riverbanks. A life that requires compromise, not constant confrontation. It was the ultimate temptation. A beautiful, intelligent woman offering him a path to easier, more legitimate power, a way to leave the endless, exhausting battle behind. The compromise is what Kent offers. Miss Dumont, Elias said, a profound sadness in his voice. I spent years paying a debt measured in steel. I will not start taking on a debt measured in comfort. As the ball wound down, Clara finally approached Elias in the cloakroom. The air between them was heavy with unsaid things, the political victory, the social tension, and the personal rift caused by Genevieve's presence. I have the final figures on the vote. Elias, Clara said, avoiding his eyes. We have just enough votes to pass the full public waterworks bill, thanks to the Dumont agreement. But Kent is planning an immediate vote of no confidence on the entire council. He's going to use the gossip against us. Asterisk, asterisk, yes. The whispers about you, about me, about our unorthodox partnership. He will argue that the council is being manipulated by a single illegitimate power structure, us. He will try to destroy your reputation by destroying mine. Elias looked at her, his fatigue replaced by a cold clarity. The ballroom shadows had finally revealed the true threat. Not economic, but personal destruction. The House of Ambition was strong, but its inhabitants were vulnerable. Then we must give Kent no shadow to hide in, Elias said, taking her hand. He didn't offer comfort. He offered certainty. The debt we paid in the canyon gave us power. The debt we owe to this city is our reputation. We cannot let gossip defeat us. He paused, looking at Clara not as a political ally, but as the woman who shared his singular, dangerous ambition. We have faced the fire and the flood. Clara, we have built this house together. Let's make the foundations undeniable. The noise of the retreating carriages filled the night. Elias Thorne, the simple carpenter-turned-politician, had navigated the treacherous ballroom. He knew the next move had to be decisive, unifying their ambition, their future, and their defense against the gathering shadows of gossip and betrayal. The political victory at the territorial charity ball was short-lived. Elias Thorne had successfully secured the right-of-way for the Public Waterworks Initiative from the Dumont family, and the city council, under public pressure, had narrowly approved the bill allowing for the necessary public bonds to be issued. The House of Ambition had been structurally approved, but the cornerstone was still missing. The reformers needed to sell $200,000 worth of municipal bonds in the open market to finance the project, a massive sum for the young territory. Their success relied on securing the purchase of these bonds before their political rivals could sabotage the offering. Senator Thaddeus Moss and Silas Kent understood that money moved faster than public opinion. They couldn't win the political battle on Liberty Street, so they decided to win the financial war on Wall Street, using the only clock that truly mattered. The market. The siege began exactly 3 days after the ball. Elias and Clara were huddled in the Chronicle office, the room littered with financial prospectuses. When the news arrived via an urgent telegram from their loan, friendly banking contact in San Francisco. Urgent. Moss. Syndicate launching preemptive. Strike. Discrediting Sacramento bonds. Counter-offering. Private notes at exorbitant rate. Credit. Drying up. Market clock is ticking. Proceed with caution. Preemptive strike, Elias murmured, recognizing the ruthlessness of the move. Kent and Moss are flooding the market with competitive private notes, essentially short-term, high-interest loans to the city's major investors. They are tying up every available dollar to make sure there is no capital left to buy our low-interest, long-term public bonds. It's a financial chokehold, Elias, Clara added, running her finger down the list of initial interested investors. If we can't sell the bonds in the next 2 weeks, the authorization expires. We lose the waterworks, and the city council loses its credibility. The House of Ambition collapses from within. The clock began its relentless ticking. Elias knew they couldn't fight Kent and Moss head-on. The combined wealth of the Moss Syndicate and their banking allies was vast. Their own war chest was a collection of pennies. They needed a radical move that would break the financial siege and simultaneously expose the sheer cynical desperation of their opponents. We need to turn the market clock against them, Elias declared. We need to show the buyers that Kent's safe private notes are, in fact, the greatest risk. Their strategy relied on 3 concurrent, high-stakes maneuvers. Clara immediately drafted an urgent personal letter, not to a bank, but to Silas Finch in New York Augustus, Finch's dissident brother and her benefactor. The letter was a masterpiece of financial leverage, disguised as a moral plea. It detailed how Moss and Kent were using the very same ruthless tactics that had ruined Elias's father and driven Maeve O'Connell from Pittsburgh. It argued that Kent's high-interest notes were built on unstable ground, the expectation that the waterworks would fail, causing the city to implode. The plea was simple. Silas Finch had the moral capital and the liquid wealth to single-handedly buy a significant portion of the Sacramento bonds. A single large purchase would signal to the market that the bonds were a sound moral and financial investment. Breaking Kent's lock. You're betting on Silas's conscience. Clara, Elias said, sealing the letter. No, Elias, I'm betting on his hatred of his brother's legacy. Silas wants to prove that his kind of capital-responsible, ethical investment can triumph over Augustus's brute force. This is his chance to win the war his brother lost. Clara explained. The letter was entrusted to a fast-riding courier with strict instructions to take the swiftest mail stage to the East Coast, a journey that would take at least 12 agonizing days. The clock was running. Clara, simultaneously transformed the Sacramento Chronicle into a temporary financial tabloid. She published a detailed, highly technical editorial exposing the true terms of Kent's private notes, their short maturity, the risk of early recall, and the implicit bet they placed against the city's long-term health. The editorial was titled, "The High Price of Kent's Kindness: How Private Notes Bankroll Public Ruin." She didn't use inflammatory political language. She used numbers. She argued that any investor buying Kent's notes was complicit in the disease and eventual ruin of Sacramento, thus destroying the long-term value of their own land holdings. This tactic was aimed at the newly wealthy landowners, the very men who feared chaos and cherished stability. The immediate reaction was confusion, then panic, the fear of social ostracism, and the financial calculation of their own long-term interests caused a handful of local investors to hesitate, pulling a small but crucial amount of capital out of Kent's pool dot to buy time for Silas Finch's response. Elias had to act decisively to secure a portion of the funds locally and force the council to extend the authorization deadline. Elias called a citizens' assembly on the steps of the courthouse. He delivered the most audacious speech of his career. "They say our bonds are worthless." Elias roared, his voice ringing with conviction. "They say Sacramento is doomed to rot. They say only the rich deserve clean water. But I say, we are the strength of this city. We are its future." He then pulled out his own life savings, the hard-won profits from his carpentry business, a small but visible stack of gold eagles. "I may be a carpenter, but I understand a worthy investment. I believe in this city. I believe in clean water. I will be the first to buy the people's bonds." Elias publicly purchased the first $1,000 worth of municipal bonds. The effect was electrifying. McCann, the miners' leader, stepped forward immediately and bought $500 worth, using the shared funds of his mining association. Other small merchants and landowners, shamed by the massive fortunes they had accumulated under Elias's new laws, began to contribute. They weren't buying a bond. They were buying insurance against the return of the old corruption. The gossip? The people's bonds began to sell, slowly, painfully, but they sold. The clock was still ticking, but Elias and Clara had bought themselves a precious few days. Silas Kent and Senator Moss were enraged. The local counter-campaign was costing them heavily, but their ultimate victory still hinged on the failure of the Eastern. Market. Kent confronted Elias at the city council offices, his face contorted with barely contained fury. "You are gambling with the health of the city, Thorne?" Kent hissed. "You and your anarchist press are destroying the very credit you seek to build. Your bonds are worthless. Nobody in New York will touch them." "We'll see, Kent," Elias said calmly, though the anxiety was a constant heavy weight in his gut. "The difference between us is that you sell fear. I sell future, and the future always pays a better dividend." Kent sneered. "The market doesn't trade in sentiment, Thorne. It trades in certainty. And I have made certain that you are isolated. You have 9 days left, Elias. Enjoy your clean water while you can, because when that clock strikes, you will be holding nothing but worthless paper." The next 9 days were a blur of nervous waiting and ceaseless work. Clara maintained the local pressure, using the Chronicle to publish updates on the people's bond sales, transforming the financial struggle into a rallying cry for municipal independence. Elias worked on the engineering plans, focusing on the sheer, tangible reality of the project, the maps, the pipes, the pump specifications. He was distracting himself, finding comfort in the physical certainty of his original trade. The deadline loomed. The city council was scheduled to vote on whether to extend the bond authorization by another 6 months. Moss and Kent had bribed or leveraged enough votes to defeat the extension, effectively killing the waterworks and crippling Elias's political career. The final, decisive meeting was set for a Friday afternoon. The fate of the entire territorial integrity movement rested on the arrival of a single piece of paper from New York. Friday. Morning dawned cold and gray. Elias and Clara waited in the Chronicle office, the silence more agonizing than the constant clanking of the press. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder than ever. At 11 a.m. The city council meeting began. At 11:30 a.m. the debate opened. Kent gave a polished, devastating speech, tearing into the bond sales, calling them a populist failure, and demanding that the council end this farce immediately. At 11:45 a.m., the vote was about to be called. Elias stood by the large map of the proposed waterworks, utterly defeated. They had failed. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a frantic pounding on the door. A mud-splattered courier burst in, waving a thick, official-looking document. Telegram. San Francisco Post. Express route. The document was rushed to Elias. It wasn't the bond purchase confirmation. It was a private bank transfer notice. The document was from the Silas Finch Investment Trust. New York. Elias, read the son aloud, his voice trembling with disbelief and triumph. Transfer of $150,000 for the purchase of the Sacramento municipal bonds at par value. The entire room erupted. The amount was staggering enough to immediately secure the bulk of the financing. The financial siege was broken. Kent, seeing his entire operation crumble, leaped up, his face ashen. Fraud. This is an illegal foreign intervention. I demand an investigation. But Senator Moss, a man who understood the finality of capital, simply closed his briefcase. It is the market, Mr. Kent. The market has spoken. With the bonds suddenly a blue-chip investment. The remaining local investors who had been sitting on the fence rushed in to buy the remaining $50,000. Elias held the document, looking directly at Kent, a profound sense of vindication washing over him. The clock stopped ticking, Mr. Kent, and the future won. The public waterworks was secured. The House of Ambition had received its final necessary infusion of capital, ironically supplied by the moral conscience of the very family that had funded their oppressors. That evening, as the council celebrated, Elias sat with Clara. Silas didn't just buy our bonds, Clara, Elias said, looking at the city map now covered with the lines of the future water mains. He bought us legitimacy. He proved that even in the market, integrity has value. Yes, Clara agreed, a warm, knowing smile on her face. But it was a terrifying race, Elias. We cannot run a city on such desperate gambles. No, Elias said, reaching across the table and taking her hand. We run it on what we build now. The foundations are secure. Now we begin the long, slow work of laying the pipe, one section at a time. The crisis was over. The market clock had stopped for them, clearing the way for the real construction to begin. The city of Sacramento smelled of turned earth and fresh pine. The Public Waterworks Initiative was underway, a massive effort that had transformed the city's muddy streets into a controlled chaos of trenches and pipe-laying crews. The project was Elias Thorne's triumph. He was no longer the carpenter candidate, but the city's chief regulator, the undisputed architect of its future. The celebratory banquet for the first mile of laid pipe had just ended. The room was empty save for the lingering scent of brandy and success. The political climate was stable. The Moss-Kent faction was defeated, and the flow of clean water was already reducing disease. Elias and Clara Jenkins, the inseparable partners who had built this new order, stood at the zenith of their ambition. But the silence that fell between them as they locked the Chronicle office door was heavy, weighted not by external threat, but by internal truth. For over 2 years, they had shared danger, ambition, and a single vision for the territory. They were bound by the blood spilled on the American River and the ink spilled on Liberty Street. Yet, Despite their proximity, a final, essential barrier remained unbreached. Tonight, after the toasts and the public adulation had faded, the unspoken tension was unbearable. "You haven't been sleeping." "Elias," Clara said, her voice quiet but direct, as she poured 2 glasses of lukewarm water a small, symbolic toast to their success. "I sleep when the work is done, Clara," he replied, avoiding her gaze as he meticulously filed the day's project expenditure reports. He was hiding in the meticulous detail of his new life. Asterisk, asterisk. The political work is done. The financial work is secured. The construction work is sound, she insisted, pushing the papers away from his hands. The work on us is not. Elias finally looked at her. Her eyes, usually sharp and analytical, were softened by an exhaustion that mirrored his own. But beneath the weariness was a fierce, insistent honesty. "What is there to work on, Clara? We are partners. We are allies. We have a city to run. We are more than that, and we both know it," she countered, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "But you hold a piece of yourself back. There is a debt you haven't written off, a reason you won't step into the light of this success without looking over your shoulder. It's not Finch, it's not Moss, it's the past, and it's time to tell me what it is." The moment stretched, taut and fragile, under the single hanging lamp. The midnight hour was upon them dot. Elias walked to the window, staring out at the new straight trenches that scarred the city, the tangible evidence of his relentless drive. "It's about my father," Elias began, the words tasting like ash. "You know he lost everything. His home, his dignity. I told you it was due to disastrous investments. That was a lie. It was worse." He turned back to face her, the confession spilling out, harsh and unforgiving. "My father didn't lose his investments. He stole them. Not from strangers, but from his own community in Baltimore. He was managing the retirement funds for the local dockworkers' guild, honest men who spent their lives hauling cargo. He gambled it all on a ridiculous, fraudulent railroad stock, trying to get rich quick and restore the family name. When the stock collapsed, the guild was ruined." Elias clenched his fists. "When he died, he left me nothing but that unsent letter and the stain of his crime. That's why I came west, not just for land, but to repay the debt of honor that he couldn't. I wasn't running to the Western Star. I was running from the shadow of theft." Clara listened in silence, absorbing the blow. The man she admired for his integrity was haunted by a legacy of profound dishonor. "The $287 debt Finch held over me, that wasn't just for passage and food," Elias continued, his voice heavy with self-loathing. "That was the exact amount I managed to scrape together by selling everything to pay back the first 2 dockworkers before I fled. I needed that debt to be specific, to be finite. I needed that debt measured in steel to be a constant. Visible punishment for my father's sin." He finally confessed the truth behind his unyielding ambition. It was not just the desire to build, but the need to atone. "I haven't slept because the names of those workers follow me. I am perpetually afraid that if I settle down, if I find peace, the messenger will come, and the new government I built will fall apart because its architect is the son of a thief." Clara did not move immediately. She walked to her heavy, iron printing press, the physical embodiment of her own freedom and her escape from that crushing industrial system. She touched the cool metal, drawing strength from the stability of the machine. "And Maeve O'Connell?" Clara asked quietly, her eyes still on the press. "The woman your printing company corresponds with? Is there something you haven't told me about her?" Elias frowned. "Maeve? She is just a contact, a teacher who settled north of here. She publishes a small paper, the Northern Light. I send her our printing templates and updates." "No," Clara said, turning, her expression suddenly sharp and revealing. Maeve O'Connell is the sister of Finn and the other O'Malley brother, the two men who are on the trail with you. The two men who left the prize contingent after the flood. Elias stared at her, stunned. I didn't know. I never asked their last name. I do, Clara whispered. I've known for 6 months. I publish her paper. Maeve O'Connell is the widow of Finn O'Connell, the man who was killed on the American River fighting Finch's thugs. The truth hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. The rivers of blood had flowed far closer to home than he realized. The O'Malley brothers, who had ridden west for gold, were not merely acquaintances. They were part of a family now entwined in his own destiny. Finn O'Connell was a good man. Elias, Clara continued, her own secret now laid bare. He and his brother were decent, hard-working men from Pittsburgh. Maeve's father died in Finch's mill. Silas Finch paid for her passage out here because she was the sister of the O'Malley boys, desperate for a new start. Clara took a deep, trembling breath. I didn't tell you because I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew the true weight of the canyon battle, that one of the men who died was tied to the very people who helped me. Escape Finch's system, it would shatter your conviction. I protected you from the debt of guilt. The confessions hung in the midnight air, Elias's shame over his father's theft, and Clara's calculated omission about the victim in the canyon. Both had built their perfect partnership on a flawed foundation of secrecy, each trying to protect the other from a truth that could ruin everything. So, the house of ambition we built is founded on a thief's atonement and a lie. Elias finally said, the statement devoid of malice, only desolate acceptance. The house is built on truth. Elias, Clara insisted, walking toward him, her hands reaching out to hold his face. Your father was a thief, but you are not. You risked your life, your name, and your future to repay a debt you never incurred. And yes, I lied to protect you, but I did it because I needed you to survive long enough to build this city. This city needs you more than it needs perfection. Perfection is the foundation of trust, Clara, Elias said, pulling away, the pain raw in his eyes. Trust is the foundation of love, Elias, and that is the only thing we haven't confessed in this midnight hour. The sudden admission was more explosive than any cannon fire. The unspoken bond, the deep-seated reliance and affection that had fueled their entire alliance, was finally articulated. We built a city, but we can't build a life on secrets, Elias, Clara urged. We have to face the rest of the world and the new enemies together. But we can only do that if we face each other here tonight, without the protection of the press or the council. Elias looked at her, at the woman who knew his deepest shame and his greatest triumph, who had fought beside him in the mud and the moral high ground. She saw him not as a disgraced son, but as the architect of a new beginning. The shame of my father's theft, the blood of Finn O'Connell. Elias whispered, the ghosts of the past crowding into the room. The shame is his, not yours, Clara said fiercely. And the blood was shed for the freedom we won. You honored O'Connell by building a city where his widow Maeve can raise her family without the fear of men like Finch. The ultimate atonement is not silence, Elias. It is transparency. Elias walked back to his desk. He picked up his pen and a clean sheet of paper. You are right, he said, his voice now steady, infused with a new, sober resolve. We have to turn the final debt into the final strength. He began to write, not a political bill, but a personal disclosure. He wrote a complete account of his father's crime, his flight from Baltimore, and the specific $287 debt that had haunted his journey. I will deliver this to the city council tomorrow, Elias stated, looking at Clara. I will tell them the full truth, before the Moss faction can find it and use it to destroy us. I will show them that the architect of this city does not hide his past. If they strip me of my title, so be it. But they will not strip me of my integrity. Asterisk, asterisk, Clara nodded, her eyes full of pride and relief. We will publish the complete account in the Chronicle simultaneously. We will frame it as the confession of integrity, the only public official willing to lay his entire past before the people. We will use the truth as our final, unassailable weapon. The last of the secrets was gone. In the quiet resolution of the midnight hour, the political partnership transformed into an unshakable, loving alliance, founded on absolute, terrifying truth. The House of Ambition was finally built on solid ground. They had survived the external wars. Now, armed with honesty, they were ready for the internal challenges that would inevitably follow. The year was 1858. The House of Ambition. In Sacramento, the modern waterworks, the stable land titles, the honest council was a beacon of successful governance in the turbulent West. Elias Thorne, having survived the political fallout of his confession of integrity, now served as the territory's chief advocate. But the city's success was precarious. Without official statehood, California remained vulnerable to federal oversight and the predatory financial schemes of Eastern syndicates, which still viewed the West as a resource to be exploited. The final chapter of their fight lay in Washington, D.C. Elias and Clara Jenkins were selected as the territory's official delegation, tasked with presenting the petition for statehood and securing federal grants for vital infrastructure, a transcontinental telegraph line, and improved mail routes. Their mission was to bridge the vast physical and political chasm between the western coast and the eastern capital. Their journey was to be the modern version of Elias's original trek, no longer by ox-drawn wagon, but by the fastest steamships, stagecoaches, and nascent rail lines available. It was a journey across the continental divide, both literal and metaphorical. The first leg of their journey took them to San Francisco, where they boarded a steamship bound for the Panama Isthmus, still the fastest route. Despite its dangers, standing on the deck, watching the gold-stained hills of California recede into the mist, Elias felt a profound sense of closure and anxiety. We are leaving the house we built. Clara, Elias murmured, looking at the distant silhouette of the city. It feels like leaving a child unguarded. The foundation is solid, Elias, Clara replied, leaning against the railing. The people who helped us build it, McCann, Vance, they will guard the walls. But the threats in Washington are more subtle than thugs and hydraulic cannons. We are leaving the world of physical strength for the world of political rhetoric. The voyage was a cramped, uncomfortable mirror of the nation itself. On board, they encountered all walks of American life. Polished Eastern bankers heading west to invest in railroads, rough-hewn miners returning east with bulging money belts, and Southern planters heading to Cuba. Elias and Clara, once the lowliest of immigrants and laborers, were now treated as territorial nobility, a testament to their hard-won success. But the respect was conditional. It rested entirely on the perceived wealth of California. The most telling encounter was with Mr. Philip Albright, a prominent New York financier known for his close ties to the old Augustus Finch syndicate. Albright, a man of immaculate manners and predatory eyes, sought them out immediately. "Councilman Thorne, Miss Jenkins," Albright said, his smile polite but cold. "A pleasure. Your success with the waterworks is noted, but Washington is not Sacramento. They speak a different language there, the language of precedent and patronage. Your zealotry will be seen as quaint. We speak the language of necessity, Mr. Albright," Clara countered sharply. "The necessity of a growing, self-governing population." Albright laughed gently. "Self-governance is an illusion, Miss Jenkins. Someone always holds the deed. Be warned. The capital is a city where every ambition casts a shadow, and where debts never truly disappear." His veiled threat. reminder that the Finch network still existed was a chilling introduction to the complexities awaiting them. The journey across the Isthmus of Panama was a brutal reminder of the raw, untamed reality that lay beneath the veneer of national expansion. They traveled by mule and canoe through humid, disease-ridden jungle, witnessing the grim conditions endured by the construction crews, many of them poor, immigrants laboring on the nascent transcontinental railway. Not it was a physical continental divide, the point where the oceans met and where the raw, exploitable labor of the world converged. Once on the Caribbean side, they boarded a final steamship to New Orleans and then finally began the grinding multi-day journey north on the American rail network. As they traveled, the landscape changed dramatically. The raw, beautiful wilderness of the West gave way to the manicured, organized farms of the Midwest, and then to the smoke-choked factories and teeming cities of the industrialized East. They were crossing the philosophical divide of America, from the society built on the individual, self-made man, to the society built on system and corporation. In every city, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Baltimore, they encountered the stark social divisions that Elias had once fled. Overcrowded slums, towering factories, and an air of permanent, entrenched inequality. "Look, Elias," Clara said quietly, as their train sped past a massive city industrial complex near Philadelphia. "That is the source of all the steel that almost choked us. That is the true engine of the nation's power." Elias stared out the window, seeing the thousands of faceless workers moving like automatons. The freedom they had secured in California felt fragile here, dwarfed by the immense impersonal scale of Eastern capital. "We were fighting a man, Finch," Elias realized. "But here, we are fighting a structure, a system that measures human worth and efficiency, just as my father did." The atmosphere in Washington, D.C. was suffocatingly formal. It was a city of marbled halls, precise rituals, and deep, entrenched hierarchies, a complete contrast to the practical, honest chaos of Sacramento. Elias and Clara, dressed in their best, found themselves immediate outsiders. They were the delegates of the Gold Coast, treated with a blend of fascination and condescending dismissal. Their first critical meeting was with the House Committee on Territories, led by a powerful aging congressman named Senator Vance. The meeting was a disaster. Elias presented their case with the forthright sincerity that had won him elections in Sacramento, detailing the territory's stability, its self-funded waterworks, and its reformed land laws. But the committee was uninterested in his earnest facts. They were interested in leverage. "Councilman Thorne," Senator Vance drawled, adjusting his spectacles, "your petition is admirable, but statehood for California raises significant questions regarding the transcontinental telegraph bill. Who, precisely, will control the construction rights? And what guarantees do we have that your volatile territory will remain financially stable enough to warrant full federal representation?" The message was clear. Statehood was being held hostage to a massive federal infrastructure contract. The contract, they strongly implied, needed to be awarded to a reliable Eastern firm, one with whom the committee had a long-standing understanding. Elias realized they weren't debating governance. They were negotiating a bribe. "We are offering stability, Senator," Elias insisted. "We have proven we can manage our own affairs." "You proved you could start a riot, Councilman," another committee member scoffed, referencing the Canyon battle. "And we have read the reports of your public confession concerning your father's unfortunate financial dealings. Your territory's leadership is founded on a shaky past, Mr. Thorne." The attack was precise and devastating. Albright's warning was now a reality. Elias's courageous truth-telling in Sacramento had become a political vulnerability in Washington. That evening, defeated and demoralized, Elias and Clara retreated to their small, expensive room at Willard's Hotel. They are using my father's shame as a weapon against the entire territory, Elias said, slamming his fist onto the table. I can't fight shadows here, Clara. I can't tell a congressman he's corrupt. He'll merely smile and ask me to prove it legally, which I can't. Clara, however, was already in strategic mode. She pulled out a small, worn ledger, a copy of the accounts she kept on every major financial player in the West, including every asset Finch had ever bought or sold. We can't fight them with their rules, Elias, she said, her voice low and fierce. We fight them with their own ambition. They want the telegraph bill. That means they have a preferred company. And that preferred company must have a single massive financial backer. Clara pointed to a name in her ledger, the Consolidated Communications Trust. Its primary shareholder was listed as Titus Albright, the brother of Philip Albright, the banker they had met on the ship. The Albright family is the new face of the Finch Syndicate, Clara deduced. They want the telegraph contract, and they want statehood on their terms, which means appointing a government they can control. The true antagonist of the West was not a single man, but the interconnected web of wealth and political influence in the East. Their final maneuver was a desperate, high-stakes gamble. Clara composed a letter, carefully worded and anonymous, and delivered it directly to the most powerful, incorruptible newspaper editor in Washington, D.C., a man known for his hatred of corporate monopoly. The letter contained only 3 key pieces of information. 1. The complete, documented failure of the Sacramento Land Titles Act to financially cripple the former Finch Syndicate, the Albright family. Point 2. The immense potential profitability of the transcontinental telegraph bill. 3. The specific amount of shares held by Senator Vance and his committee members in the Consolidated Communications Trust. The philosophical divide between the honest politics of the West and the entrenched corruption of the East had to be bridged by a powerful external force, the free press. The next morning, the Washington paper ran the expose on its front page. The price of wires, how corporate monopolies hold statehood hostage. The effect was instantaneous and explosive. The investigation was launched. The committee was paralyzed, and the true cost of California's statehood was laid bare before the entire nation. Elias and Clara had crossed the continental divide, leaving behind the threat of physical violence, only to face the calculated, suffocating threat of political power. But they had brought their own weapons, the honesty forged in the West, and the uncompromising press that was the lifeblood of their ambition. Elias looked at Clara, his deep respect for her strategy overwhelming the fatigue of the journey. We didn't just cross the continent, Clara. We crossed the line. There is no going back to the local fight now. There is no local fight. Anymore, Elias, Clara agreed, a fierce determination in her eyes. The house of ambition is built for the nation now. They had won the battle for the territory, but the larger war for national legitimacy had just begun. The fate of California now rested on the outcome of the political firestorm they had ignited in the capital. Washington, D.C., late winter 1858, was in the throes of a political crisis. Clara Jenkins's expose detailing how Congressman Vance and his committee held California's statehood hostage to secure personal profit from the transcontinental telegraph bill had detonated across the capital. The resulting outrage paralyzed Congress and cast a harsh light on the entrenched corruption that polluted the nation's highest offices. Elias Thorne and Clara, the accidental political revolutionaries, were now locked in the final stage of their war. They had moved beyond fighting for a city's waterworks. They were fighting for a state's sovereignty. The reckoning was at hand. The political landscape was a minefield. Congressman Vance and his allies, though publicly disgraced, were far from defeated. They used every rule, delay tactic, and backroom deal to postpone the vote on California's statehood petition, hoping the scandal would fade and the territorial delegation would run out of funds and patience. They are using the calendar as a weapon, Elias, Clara warned, pacing their cramped, airless room near the Capitol. She was frantically writing editorials, sending dispatches back to the supported newspapers in the East and West. Every day we stay here costs us a small fortune, and every delay erodes our political capital. They want to starve us out of the fight. Elias, who had spent years fighting the economic siege of Augustus Finch, understood the strategy. The founders of the old system were masters of institutional delay. Their most immediate and dangerous new enemy emerged: Senator Silas Kent, Elias's former Sacramento rival. After his failure to derail the waterworks, Kent had fled California and established himself in Washington, D.C. as a lobbyist for the powerful Eastern banking interests, including the Albright family. He was now the Moss-Finch syndicate's last line of defense. Kent confronted Elias in the marble hallway of the Senate office building. "Councilman Thorne," Kent purred, immaculate in his wool coat, "your little newspaper war was impressive, but you finally reached the end of the line. The issue is no longer corruption. It's constitutional precedent. The Congress will never grant statehood to a territory led by a confessed and widely publicized debtor whose father was a known thief. I have ensured every key senator has a copy of your chronicle confession." Kent smiled, a viperous flash of triumph. "You forced them to choose between financial corruption and moral integrity. They will choose the status quo. You are too flawed, Thorne, to found a state." Elias felt the immense, cold weight of his past, the shame of the unsent letter, crushing his present ambition. "We came here for the people of California, Kent, not for personal absolution," Elias stated, his voice steady despite the doubt that gnawed at him. "And the people of California will be betrayed by their flawed founder," Kent finished, walking away, his words echoing the central dilemma of Elias's life. The vote was scheduled for the end of the week. Elias and Clara had to find a final piece of leverage, something so powerful it would force Congress to act, overriding the constitutional squeamishness and the ingrained corruption. "We cannot fight the constitutional issue directly," Clara concluded, poring over complex financial documents, the same documents that detailed the Albright syndicate's assets. "We must attack the legal and economic stability of the very men who oppose us." Clara had secured a complete, detailed manifest of the assets liquidated by Augustus Finch and purchased by the Albright family years ago. Among the vast portfolio were the original, complex, and highly ambiguous Spanish land grants that formed the basis of much of the Albright family's real estate wealth in San Francisco. The land titles bill we passed in Sacramento was perfect. "Elias, it secured the titles for the small settlers," Clara explained. "But the vast, old Spanish grants are still governed by an antiquated Federal Review Board that Vance happens to chair." Elias understood immediately. If the Congress continued to delay statehood, the Review Board under Vance's orders could declare the foundation of the Albright family's multi-million-dollar San Francisco real estate portfolio invalid. Finch's old asset is a bomb waiting to go off. Elias realized. "Exactly," Clara affirmed. "If we publicly announce our intention to petition the Federal Review Board to launch an immediate, comprehensive review of all Spanish land grants, and we hint that the Albright titles are unstable, the consequences will be immediate." The threat was simple: delay statehood, and we plunged the entire San Francisco real estate market into chaos. The final confrontation took place, not on the Senate floor, but in a closed-door meeting in the Speaker's chambers, brokered by a sympathetic, reform-minded congressman. Present were Elias and Clara, Congressman Vance, and Senator Silas Kent, representing the Albright financial interests. The room was tense, the air thick with political exhaustion. "Let us stop the pretense," Vance said, his face haggard from the scandal. "Your petition is stalled, Thorne. Your past makes you a liability. Granting statehood now is too risky. The risk is not to the nation, Congressman, Elias countered, placing a heavy file of documents on the table. The risk is to the Albright family fortune. Elias looked at Kent, the man who had stalked him from the western trails to the marble halls. We have here, Mr. Kent, a full declaration of our intent to challenge the Federal Review of all major Spanish land grants in the San Francisco Bay Area. If statehood is delayed, the current unreliable Federal Review process remains in place. We will petition the Review Board to declare the Albright land titles purchased directly from Augustus Finch null and void based on faulty original surveys. Kent's smooth composure finally cracked. He understood the gravity of the threat. A legal challenge to their land titles would immediately halt all development in San Francisco, paralyzing the most profitable venture in the entire Eastern Syndicate. That is economic warfare, Thorne. You can't legally do that. Kent sputtered. We can, Clara interjected, her voice cold and precise. And we will. The land titles bill we passed in Sacramento gives the territory immense power over its own destiny. If you refuse to grant us the final dignity of statehood, we will exercise every single power we currently possess to enforce economic transparency. Your choice is simple, Congressman Vance. Grant us the vote and stability, or face the financial ruin of your primary backers. The tables were finally turned. Elias, the former debtor, was now dictating terms to the nation's financial elite. He had learned the language of power, leverage over life, not life over leverage. Vance looked at Kent, then back at the calm, resolute figures of Elias and Clara. He saw two people who would stop at nothing to secure their vision, people who had already paid a price in blood and confession that no Eastern politician could match. The old founders were defeated by the new. Founders. The following day, the Senate and the House, under immense pressure to avoid a massive economic collapse in San Francisco, voted overwhelmingly to grant California statehood. The reckoning was complete. Elias and Clara stood together in the gallery of the Capitol, watching the proceedings. As the final tally was announced, a wave of profound relief and quiet triumph washed over them. We did it. Elias, Clara whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. We built the house, and then we secured the foundation of the nation for it. Elias agreed. The debt is finally paid, not with money, but with self-governance. They had not only secured statehood, but they had forced a nationwide conversation about corruption and the true price of progress. They had crossed the entire continental divide to prove that integrity was not just a moral virtue, but a powerful political force. Returning to California months later, Elias and Clara were no longer just delegates. They were the founders of the state. They married quietly in the spring of 1859, a union sealed not by traditional vows, but by a shared promise to the future of the new state. They ran their house of ambition together, Elias serving on the first state senate, meticulously drafting the state's constitution, and Clara running the Sacramento Chronicle, which became one of the most respected, powerful newspapers on the West Coast. Their life was not one of wealth or ease. It was a tireless dedication to governance. Their ambition was not for personal glory, but for the creation of a stable, just republic, the enduring inheritance they intended to leave. One afternoon, Elias stood on the rise overlooking Sacramento, watching the construction of the permanent state capitol building. We laid the first pipes. Clara, we fought the first battle, Elias mused, holding her hand. The work is endless, but the foundation is secure. The house stands, Elias, Clara confirmed, smiling. And it was built with the steel of your character and the ink of our truth. No debt can ever tear it down. The promise of the Western Star had finally been realized. It was not a promise of instant gold, but the arduous, continuous promise of self-determination, secured by the hard-won integrity of its founders. The year was 1875. 26 years had passed since Elias Thorne first stood on the muddy banks of the Missouri River, chasing the ethereal promise of the Western Star. California was no longer a territory. It was a full, thriving state. The star secured in the flagged out Sacramento had transformed. The trenches of the public waterworks were now buried deep beneath paved streets, feeding a city that boasted magnificent civic buildings, bustling commerce, and crucially, a stability that few eastern cities possessed. The constant sound was no longer the clang of conflict, but the steady, measured hum of legitimate progress. Elias Thorne, at 45, was a respected elder statesman, having stepped away from the state senate after serving 2 defining terms. He now consulted on state infrastructure projects, focusing on securing the Sierra Nevada watershed a final, protective gesture toward the land that had granted him redemption. He and Clara Jenkins Thorne, still the formidable editor and publisher of the Sacramento Chronicle, lived in a modest but elegant home near the newly completed state capitol. Their marriage was a seamless union of shared conviction and complementary strengths. He the builder, she the voice. The inheritance they had fought for was visible everywhere, but it was most poignant in the details of their family. They had 2 children, Thomas, Clara's son, now a brilliant, politically minded lawyer working to defend the integrity of the state constitution, and their own daughter, Eliza, 22, who had inherited her father's practical resolve and her mother's fierce intellectual curiosity, and was currently studying geology at the University of California. One quiet evening, Elias sat in his study, looking over a brittle old ledger. It wasn't a state document. It was the final, meticulously kept record of the $287. That the money he owed the Baltimore dockworkers that had haunted his life. Over the decades, he had tracked down the families of the original victims of his father's theft, sending them discreet, incremental payments, far exceeding the initial amount, until the debt was fully and honorably repaid. He carefully closed the ledger, a profound sense of peace settling over him. The final personal reckoning was complete. The inheritance he left his children would be clean, built not on gold or land, but on the restoration of a tarnished name. The door opened, and Clara entered, carrying a heavy, wrapped gift. "Happy anniversary, Elias," she said, her eyes warm. "Your daughter found this for you." Elias unwrapped the gift. It was a smooth, heavy sphere of iron, polished to a dull shine. "It's a cannonball, Elias," Clara explained. "A relic from the Civil War?" "No," Elias corrected, recognizing the metallic density. "It's a piece of slag, a relic of the Bessemer process. It's steel." Eliza had found it near the remnants of a failed early rolling mill near Oakland. It was a physical reminder of the east of the soot, the ambition, and the steel that had driven the entire narrative. "She wanted you to have a symbol of the material you conquered," Clara said, touching the cold metal. "The debt you paid was not in money, but in your character. That is the true inheritance." The stability they had built, however, was facing a new, insidious threat, not external, but internal. The new challenge to the Republic came from the very institutions designed to protect it. The power of the railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad, now completed, had opened a floodgate of commerce. But it had also concentrated immense, unregulated power in the hands of a few wealthy men, the railroad barons. They controlled the transportation, the freight rates, and increasingly, the political destiny of the state through lobbying and corruption. The new antagonist was not a single, recognizable villain like Finch, but a vast, corporate monolith known simply as the Octopus, the Southern Pacific Railroad. Elias's son, Thomas, now served as the state attorney general's special counsel, and he was consumed by the fight against the barons. They are doing what Finch could only dream of. Father, Thomas argued passionately one evening, spreading a rail map across the dining table. They control every key port, every legislative vote, and every crop that leaves the state. They measure progress not in steel, but in monopoly. The republic you founded is being choked by its own success. Thomas was preparing a massive legal challenge to the railroad's exorbitant freight rates, a battle that threatened to bankrupt the state's burgeoning agricultural industry. The confrontation came to a head when the railroad barons, led by the ruthless and politically savvy lobbyist, Mr. Vernon Haas, launched a direct, personal attack designed to crush Thomas and discredit the integrity of the state. Government. The Sacramento Chronicle received an anonymous, detailed leak alleging that Thomas Thorne, during his tenure as consul, had used insider information to purchase prime Sacramento real estate, a land deal that echoed the very corruption Elias had fought against decades ago. The news was a calculated, devastating lie, a sophisticated, modern slander designed to leverage the public's memory of Elias's own confession of integrity and dismantle the moral foundation of the Thorne name. Clara, reading the headline in the rival advertiser, knew this was the ultimate test. It was the moment the old corruption reached out from the past to poison the future. Haas is using the same tactics Kent used against us. Elias, but against our son, Clara stated, her eyes blazing with editorial fury. He's using the shadow of your past to destroy Thomas's present. Elias, calm and measured, looked at the fabricated evidence. The house they are trying to tear down isn't Thomas's character, Clara. It's the integrity of the republic we built. They want the people to believe that all politicians, even the sons of the founders, are corrupt. If that belief takes root, the republic fails. The defense had to be executed on two fronts, the legal and the moral. One, the legal defense. Thomas, guided by his father's counsel, immediately filed a public lawsuit against the advertiser for libel, demanding that the newspaper reveal the source of the false information in court. This bold move forced the railroad barons to either expose their entire corrupt lobbying network or be held accountable for the false reporting. Two, the moral defense. Elias and Clara. Clara knew the power of the narrative. She published a historic signed editorial in the Chronicle that evening, titled The Price of a Clean Name. It republished Elias's confession of integrity alongside a detailed, line-by-line refutation of the slander against Thomas. The move was a masterstroke. The public, remembering the integrity of the founders, rallied instantly. The railroad barons, masters of the shadows, were exposed by the light of the press. Mr. Haas and the advertiser, facing massive public outrage and the legal demand to reveal their source, immediately backed down. The libel case was dropped, the slander retracted, and Thomas Thorne's reputation was not only cleared, but fortified by the trial. Months later, the legal battle against the railroad barons continued, led tirelessly by Thomas Thorne. The outcome was still uncertain, but the moral foundation of the fight was secured. Elias and Clara stood together on the steps of the state capitol, watching a ceremony where Eliza, their daughter, was presenting a proposal for a state-funded geological survey to protect the public lands from corporate overmining. A new generation taking up the fight for the integrity of the land. Elias held the smooth, dense sphere of steel slag in his hand. He had carried it across the continent through conflict and through peace. The fight never ends, Clara, Elias observed, his voice tinged with the weary wisdom of a man who had seen the whole arc of the Western Promise. There will always be new syndicates, new corruption, new men who mistake profit for principle. No, Clara corrected gently, placing her hand over his, resting it on the cold steel. The fight doesn't end, but the nature of the inheritance changes. We didn't leave them a debt, Elias. We left them the tools the free press, the honest laws, and the knowledge that one man, stripped of everything, can rebuild his name by building a republic. Elias looked at his children, one fighting in the courts, the other fighting for the land. They were the true inheritance. They had taken the raw, brutal ambition that drove their parents and refined it into civic duty. He smiled, finally content. The Western Star had fulfilled its promise. The life he had built, forged from shame, paid for in blood, and secured by truth, was now a sturdy, enduring republic. He tucked the piece of steel into his pocket, turning his gaze toward the vast, unsettled future of the republic they had founded.